In Regency England, an ancient title may bring more burden than honour, and a great house in disorder must place its future in unexpected hands. An earl will learn what duty truly requires, and a vicar's daughter must decide how much of her heart she dares to risk. The Earl in the Kitchen begins now. Chapter 1. A House in Uproar. When Edmund Pembroke, newly become Earl of Halverton, arrived at Halverton Hall, he expected responsibility, inconvenience, and a great many papers. He did not expect to find the household in open confusion. The house itself was handsome. It stood broad and pale at the end of a gravel sweep, with tall windows and the sort of balance that spoke of old money and settled habits, but it had been neglected. The ivy had gone too far. The shrubs were untidy, and one shutter hung crookedly enough to offend any man who liked order. Edmund did, and was not pleased that the house should present its faults before he had even crossed the threshold. He stepped down from the carriage in a dark travelling coat, his boots marked by the road but still respectable, and mounted the steps prepared to take possession of his new home with calm dignity. At that exact moment the front door flew open, and a housemaid backed out with an armful of table linen. She saw him, gave a squeak, and dropped half of it. A boy carrying coal nearly collided with her. Somewhere deeper in the house, a woman's voice declared that if anyone had touched the supper tray again, she should like to know which fool had grown tired of living. Edmund stopped on the threshold. An elderly butler appeared with the grave expression of a man who had seen much and approved of very little. "My lord," he said, bowing, "welcome to Halverton Hall." "Thank you," said Edmund, glancing past him into the disorder. "I see my arrival has inspired composure in all quarters." The butler did not so much as blink. Edmund entered the hall. At once he saw the strain in it. A stair-runner worn at the centre, flowers on the side table past their prime, polished wood gone a little dull, and servants moving with the speed of people trying to make a neglected house appear presentable. So, they had expected him. That was almost worse. Before he could speak, the housekeeper crossed the hall, keys at her waist, saw him, and stopped only long enough to curtsy. "My lord, forgive me." She turned at once to the butler. "I sent to the vicarage at 10, and it is fortunate Miss Harcourt came directly, or we should never have had the house fit to receive his lordship, much less served dinner in decent order." Edmund had only just enough time to wonder who Miss Harcourt might be before she appeared. A young woman came quickly from a side passage carrying a ledger. "Mrs. Wren," she said, without looking up. "If the blue dessert plates have gone in already, send them back. We are not receiving the Earl of Halverton on chipped edges and faded glaze." She turned, saw him, and stopped. Edmund's first thought was that she was very pretty. His second was that she looked far too intelligent to be easy in a house like this. She had bright grey eyes, brown hair arranged neatly but not securely, and the alert expression of a woman who had been solving other people's problems since breakfast. Her gown was plain morning muslin, chosen for usefulness rather than display, yet she wore it with such quiet confidence that he noticed her at once. She looked at him, then at the floor, and said, "You have brought mud onto the runner." Edmund looked down. He had. The butler closed his eyes for one brief moment. The young woman drew breath. "My lord, forgive me. You are the Earl of Halverton." "So I understand." A hint of amusement touched her mouth. "I am Miss Harcourt. My father is the vicar. Mrs. Wren sent for me this morning." Mrs. Wren added immediately, "Miss Harcourt has been good enough to help us whenever the household is overset, my lord." "And to save us from disgrace more than once," said Mr. Pritchard, the butler, with solemn conviction. Miss Harcourt gave him a look. "Mr. Pritchard is kind enough to exaggerate." "Rarely, miss," said Mr. Pritchard. That amused Edmund more than it should have. He removed his gloves. "Then Halverton Hall has formed a habit of borrowing the vicar's daughter in moments of crisis." Miss Harcourt met his gaze with composure. "Only when the household is in disorder, my lord." Then, after the smallest pause, she added, "Which has been rather often." The servants appeared to take her authority for granted. More curious still, so did she. Edmund said, "Perhaps someone will explain matters to me." The late Earl neglected the house. The accounts are tangled, the servants are tired, and since this morning we have been trying to make the hall fit to receive you, said Miss Harcourt. Dinner is only the noisiest part of the problem. Edmund felt his first real chill of understanding. "I see," he said. "No, my lord," she said. "Not yet." Then, being called away at once by fresh alarm over candles, a missing tray, and a sauce that had begun to separate, she left him standing beneath the eyes of his ancestors with the clear impression that the most capable person in Halverton Hall was a vicar's daughter who did not care in the least that he was an earl. Edmund had arrived at Halverton Hall prepared to assume command of his inheritance with steadiness, intelligence, and a proper sense of duty. Within 20 minutes he had been informed that he had muddied the runner, obstructed the staff, and nearly inconvenienced a source. It was not the beginning he had intended. He began as sensibly as he could. Since he had no wish to issue foolish orders, he set out to ask intelligent questions. This proved difficult, as everyone capable of answering them was already occupied in preventing some fresh disaster. Mr. Pritchard, intercepted near the dining room, informed him in a tone of grave endurance that the hall table was not yet settled. One footman had vanished in search of a missing tray, and half the house was still being shifted into respectability. Mrs. Wren, encountered on the stairs with a basket of freshly refolded linen on one arm, said that she would gladly account for every servant, candle and sheet in the house when there was time to do so. But as there was not, she could only beg his lordship not to move anything that had already been put somewhere for a reason. Still, Edmund persisted, and by persistence gathered a number of facts, though very little understanding. The late Earl had paid some tradesmen and ignored others. The stores were uneven, the chimneys neglected. 2 maids were doing the work of 3, and the steward had disappeared some months before, leaving behind confused papers and unanswered bills. By the time Edmund reached the study, he possessed several alarming pieces of information and no clear notion how they joined together. By late afternoon, the worst of the confusion had settled into a more orderly kind of strain. Dinner was still advancing, somehow toward the table. Halverton Hall no longer sounded as though it might collapse. It merely sounded tired. Eliza Harcourt paused outside the study with the still-room book in one hand and a short list of household stores in the other. She had spent much of the day keeping the new Earl from blundering into difficulties he did not yet understand, and had formed a fair opinion of him in the process. He was not foolish, which was a comfort. He was simply too certain that order could be restored by asking the right questions in the right tone. Still, he had listened. That alone set him above his predecessor. She knocked and entered. Edmund stood at the writing table, looking down at a disorderly spread of bills, memoranda, and account books, with the grave attention of a man trying to impose sense by force of character. He had changed from his travelling clothes into a dark coat of excellent cut, fresh linen at his collar and cuffs, and a perfectly tied cravat. He looked, Eliza thought, exactly as an earl ought to look. He was also extremely handsome, which was inconvenient. He raised his head as she entered. "Miss Harcourt." "My lord." She lifted the still-room book slightly. "I thought you might by now have reached the preserves and require support." He gave a brief laugh. "I have reached the preserves," he said. "Also soap, lamp oil, 3 unpaid invoices, and what appears to be a long-standing grievance involving coal." "That would be the steward's hand," said Eliza, coming to the table. "He wrote as though ordinary household needs were a personal affront. He left some months ago under circumstances Mrs. Wren calls unsatisfactory, and Mr. Pritchard declines to describe at all." He half moved toward the nearest chair, but she had already set the still-room book on the table and opened it to the relevant page. "This account is more accurate than the rest," she said. "Mrs. Wren has kept it from being interfered with." Edmund glanced from the page to her. "Am I to understand that half this house has survived only because someone prevented the other half from managing it?" "Yes," said Eliza. "That is a fair summary." Amusement touched his face again. She pointed to the papers before him. "The trouble is not that everything is ruined," she said. It is that everything has been neglected at once. Bills unanswered, repairs postponed, supplies ordered without thought, servants expected to manage shortages as though economy were a form of magic. He listened without interruption. At length he said, "And everyone in this house already knows that." "Of course they do," said Eliza. "They live here." He looked down again at the accounts. "When I arrived," he said after a moment, "I thought I should examine the books, dismiss a few incompetent people, give clear orders, and set matters right by degrees." Eliza folded her hands. "A very gentlemanlike plan." His mouth shifted. "You mean a useless one?" "I mean," she said, "that it would work better in an account book than in a house." That won another laugh from him, quieter this time. Then his expression changed. "I do not yet know where to begin," he said. There it was at last. Not a request exactly, but near enough. Eliza looked at him more gently than she had intended. For all his title and careful manner, he was trying not to make matters worse in a place where mistakes had consequences for everyone. "No," she said. "But you may learn." He met her eyes. Eliza, looking back at him across the untidy spread of bills and account books, saw him more clearly. He was not a fool, only a man standing in the wrong room with the wrong kind of confidence. Neither of them spoke about what was to come. He did not ask for her help. She did not offer it plainly. But the need was there between them all the same, quiet and unmistakable. Then, from somewhere beyond the corridor, a bell rang sharply, followed by quick footsteps and the unmistakable sound of someone hurrying with more purpose than composure. Eliza glanced toward the door. "I must go," she said. "Mrs. Wren will have discovered some fresh cause for alarm." She gathered up the still-room book, but left the smaller account book open beside his hand. "Begin with that," she said. "It is the least misleading." Then she was gone. Edmund remained where he was, looking down at the untidy spread of bills and memoranda, aware that he had just been instructed in his own deficiencies by a woman in plain muslin, and had found the lesson useful. He made a sincere attempt to apply himself. For the next quarter of an hour he examined invoices and traced figures, only to discover that disorder became no more intelligible for being itemized. Beyond the room, the house moved in a rising tide of urgency. At last something crashed downstairs. He followed the sound. The kitchens of Halverton Hall were hot, noisy, and too busy to care who had just walked in. The air was rich with roast bones, onions, pastry, simmering stock, and fresh bread cooling on a cloth. Copper pans caught the firelight. A spit turned steadily. A maid at the table was chopping herbs with the speed of a woman who suspected she might otherwise be blamed for something. At the centre of it all stood Mrs. Biddle, the cook. She was broad, energetic, and so plainly in command that even confusion seemed to take orders from her. At the sight of Edmund she narrowed her eyes and said, with the grave disapproval of a woman already overburdened, "Good gracious, another one to manage." Every servant in view went still, and in the warmest patch by the hearth, as if all the confusion around him were of no concern whatever, lay a large ginger cat. One forepaw stretched toward the fire. His tail curled round him with the air of a creature entirely at home. At the sound of Edmund's step, he opened one golden eye, considered the newcomer, and then shut it again, as though Earls were of no consequence in a kitchen at work. "Eliza, marmalade's on the hearth rug again," came the exasperated complaint from a kitchen maid. Miss Harcourt appeared at once from beside a long table, where she had somehow been consulting a ledger while counting eggs. Without interrupting herself, she reached down, lifted the cat with practiced ease, and deposited him upon a nearby chair. "Marmalade," she said. "If you mean to be in the way, at least do not do it where people are carrying hot dishes." Mrs. Biddle, turning from the stove, said, "He catches mice, my lord, and earns his keep." Marmalade leapt down from the chair and crossed directly in front of Edmund's boots. Edmund stopped short. Eliza looked up. "Take care, Marmalade does not alter his path for strangers." "Plainly," said Edmund, glancing down at the cat, "he is a person of consequence." "He believes so," said Eliza. Mrs. Biddle gave a grunt. "He believes whatever he pleases. It serves him very well." Marmalade, having completed his inspection, rose, twined once round Eliza's skirts and settled beneath the table where the heat from the ovens gathered best. "My lord," said Eliza with admirable calm, "you have come at a very bold hour." "I heard a crash," he said. "I thought I had better see what damage had been done." "That is unfortunate," said Eliza, "because the household at present wishes only to get dinner onto the table." Mrs. Biddle gave a short sound of agreement and turned back to a saucepan. "The kitchen is expressive under pressure," said Eliza. He glanced toward the stove. "Is anything seriously wrong?" "Nothing beyond recovery, which is the most one may ask at present." She lowered her voice. "But this is not the moment to improve your understanding. Cook is struggling with the sauce, and if anyone interrupts her now, I would not answer for the consequences." Mrs. Biddle, without turning, said, "I heard that, miss." "Yes," said Eliza. "That is what I feared." A few of the servants looked quickly down, but not before Edmund caught the twitch of restrained amusement on more than one face. Eliza crossed to him. "Your late cousin neglected necessities for anything that amused him," she said in a lower voice. "There is more candied peel in this house than any reasonable household can require, and not enough lamp oil for the week." Edmund stared at her. "Candied peel? In alarming quantity. That can hardly be called sound management." "No," said Eliza, "but I believe it pleased him, and that seems to have answered for a great deal." Behind them, Mrs. Biddle demanded to know who had touched the whisk. A scullery maid froze. Mr. Pritchard appeared at the kitchen door and announced that if dinner were delayed by 10 minutes he might save the table, but not the evening. Edmund, who had spoken in the House of Lords, dealt with lawyers and managed difficult men without raising his voice, found himself obliged to make way for a boy carrying hot plates. He did so. No one thanked him. Eliza did not laugh, but her eyes suggested the temptation was very near. "I begin," he said, with dignity, "to perceive difficulties." "No, my lord," she said. "You begin to perceive dinner." And with that she turned back to the struggle, leaving Edmund in the kitchen doorway with the growing suspicion that Halverton Hall had been held together for years by weary servants, determined women, and one cook prepared to defend a sauce with her life. A quarter of an hour later, as the house gathered itself for dinner, Edmund crossed the hall and found Miss Harcourt at the foot of the staircase drawing on her gloves. Mrs. Wren stood beside her with the look of a woman too busy for sentiment and too grateful to conceal it entirely. "You have done more than enough, miss," she was saying in a low voice. "I do not know how we should have managed the day without you." "You would have managed it, only less peacefully," said Eliza. "That is a charitable view." Eliza smiled faintly and reached for the plain cloak a maid was holding ready. It struck Edmund as distinctly unfair that, after spending the day rescuing his household, she should depart before he could properly thank her, or think of anything sensible to say. She turned as he approached. "My lord." "Miss Harcourt, you are leaving." "The house appears likely to survive the next hour," she said. That seemed a suitable moment to withdraw. Now that she stood still, he could see that she looked tired. "Then Halverton Hall is very much in your debt." "It is in Mrs. Wren's debt," said Eliza, "and Mrs. Biddle's, and everyone else's who has spent the day repairing what ought not to have been left broken." He had no answer ready to that, chiefly because it was true. She drew on the second glove. "Good evening, my lord." "Good evening, Miss Harcourt." She curtsied, accepted her cloak, and went out through the front door into the fading light. Edmund stood for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, watching her go with the certain knowledge that the most capable presence in Halverton Hall had just returned to the vicarage. Dinner, when it appeared, was respectable enough to deceive anyone not already in possession of the truth. The soup was hot, the silver was properly placed, the candles burned steadily in their sockets, and the blue dessert plates had indeed replaced the others. A stranger might have concluded that Halverton Hall remained orderly, well-governed, and equal to receiving its master without distress. Edmund knew better now. He sat at the head of the table beneath the portraits of his predecessors and understood, with growing clarity, that the evening's appearance of calm had been purchased at great cost by weary servants and Miss Harcourt's formidable competence. The house had not welcomed him with dignity. It had been hastily argued into it, and for the first time since inheriting Halverton, Edmund suspected that rank might prove the least useful qualification he possessed. Chapter 2. Candied Peel. The next morning, Edmund came down to breakfast with the fixed intention of beginning as he meant to continue, sensibly, efficiently, and without being made to feel ridiculous in his own house. Halverton Hall, however, appeared to have plans of its own. The breakfast table was respectable enough, though one cup had a crack turned neatly toward the wall, the toast was slightly overdone, and the marmalade had the look of an afterthought. Edmund, who had been raised to notice everything, sat down in a dark blue coat, fawn trousers, and a cream waistcoat, and reflected that noble inheritance was proving much less stately than advertised. He had barely taken his coffee when Mr. Pritchard appeared and announced, in tones fit for a state occasion, "Miss Harcourt, my lord." Edmund looked up. Miss Harcourt entered in pale blue morning muslin with a neat spencer against the cool of the day, carrying not one ledger but 3. She had the expression of a woman who had risen early, organised her thoughts, and was entirely prepared to find other people disappointing. She made him a proper curtsy. "Good morning, my lord." Miss Harcourt. Pritchard placed the additional ledgers on the sideboard with the grave air of a man laying charges before a magistrate, then withdrew. Edmund rose. "Will you breakfast?" "I have already done so, thank you." It seemed prudent. He had no difficulty believing it. She glanced once at the coffee service, the toast, and the marmalade, and Edmund had the distinct impression that she had assessed the entire meal for quality, waste, and management in a single look. "You wished yesterday," she said, "to understand the household." "I do." "Then before you begin improving it, I must ask something of you." Edmund, who disliked that phrasing on principle, sat down again. "That sounds alarmingly like conditions." "It is exactly like conditions," she replied. She took the chair opposite him without waiting to be pressed, which made the encounter feel more like a negotiation than a breakfast. "You must not dismiss anyone in a burst of administrative virtue," she said. "Not yet." Edmund set down his cup. "I had not intended a burst. No gentleman ever does. He only means to correct abuses, and before anyone can stop him, the second housemaid is sent away, the undergardener dismissed for economy, and the cook has decided she will not remain to be insulted by reform. Surely that is an extreme example." "No," said Eliza. "Mrs. Biddle has been more alarming over less." In spite of himself, Edmund almost smiled. She went on, calm and unrelenting. "You must not assume that because a thing looks excessive it is unnecessary, nor that because it looks untidy it is foolish, nor that because a servant cannot explain a system elegantly there is no system." Edmund folded his hands. "And what, in your view, am I permitted to do?" "Listen first," she said. "Ask questions. Learn who has actually been keeping matters together. Then, when you know what depends upon what, you may issue orders to your heart's content." He looked at her for a moment. There was nothing fluttering or coy about Miss Harcourt. She was not trying to charm him into agreement. She was telling him plainly how not to make a fool of himself. It was useful. It was also trying. "You are aware," he said, "that you speak to me as if I were likely to break the house merely by touching it." Her grey eyes rested on him with complete calm. "I think," she said, "that the house has already been broken by people who touched it without understanding it. I should prefer not to watch the experiment repeated." That was difficult to answer, which Edmund found most unfair. He leaned back. "And if I decline to place myself under the governance of the vicar's daughter?" "Then," said Eliza, "you will do as you please, because you are the Earl." She said it without bitterness, and for that reason it landed harder. "But," she added, laying one hand on the top ledger, "you asked yesterday how matters may be set right. I am answering honestly. If you want a house that runs, a village that does not grumble, and a staff that stays in place, you must hear how things actually work before you begin rearranging them." Edmund looked at the ledgers, then at her, then back at the ledgers, which had all the air of waiting to prove him ignorant in several fresh directions. He disliked being managed. He disliked still more the knowledge that she was right. At last he said, "Very well." Miss Harcourt did not move. "Very well what?" He met her gaze with dignity under pressure. Very well, he said. I shall not dismiss half the county in a fit of reforming zeal. That is an excellent beginning. And I shall listen before issuing decrees. Better still. Edmund drew a breath. You seem to have rehearsed this. Only in the general sense that I have met gentlemen before. That was a very annoying thing to hear at 9:30 in one's own breakfast room. Yet when she opened the first ledger and turned it toward him, Edmund found himself leaning forward despite every injury done to his consequence. He had no honest alternative, and they both knew it. If Edmund had imagined that understanding Halverton Hall would begin in an orderly library with neatly ruled columns and sensible summaries, he was disappointed before 10 o'clock. Miss Harcourt began with the pantry. This, she said, opening the door with the air of a woman presenting evidence, is where theory generally goes to die. Edmund looked in. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with jars, tins, sacks, baskets, and parcels whose labels ranged from careful precision to hopeful guesswork. There were preserves, tea caddies, spice tins, dried herbs, eggs in baskets, and flour sacks beneath the lower shelves. But what caught Edmund's eye at once was the candied peel. It did not occupy a shelf, or even several shelves. It appeared in a large barrel near the back wall, as though Halverton Hall had been provisioning for a siege conducted entirely in cakes. Beside the flour sacks sat Marmalade, composed as ever, with the air of a creature taking inventory for his own purposes. Marmalade, said Eliza, without surprise. You are not conducting a review. The cat blinked at her, then at Edmund, and remained exactly where he was. He appears, said Edmund, to think otherwise. He appears, Eliza returned, to think many things. Marmalade rose, stretched luxuriantly, and brushed with grave deliberation against Eliza's skirts before passing between Edmund's boots and disappearing beneath the next shelf in search, no doubt, of mice or cream or both. Edmund looked after him. Am I to understand he has free run of the pantry? I am afraid he granted it to himself some years ago, she replied. There was also, he quickly discovered, enough sugar to sustain a minor campaign. He stared at the stacked cones and jars. Good gracious! Yes, said Eliza, that was very nearly my own conclusion. Edmund stared at the shelf. Does the household consume sugar by the shovel? Your late cousin was strongly attached to cakes and sweetmeats, said Eliza, moving farther in to tap a shelf, and seems to have addressed the matter by buying sugar in heroic quantities. He had a decided partiality for preserved cherries, candied orange peel, and anything that looked festive at dessert. Edmund lifted one jar, then another. There are 6 jars of cherries. 9, said Eliza. 3 are in the still room. Mrs. Wren put them out of sight in the hope that if your late cousin did not see them, he might not order more. That suggests prior experience. It does. She crossed to the opposite wall. Now here, by contrast, we have lamp oil, or rather, what remains of it. Edmund bent to look at the small, dispiriting collection of bottles. This cannot be sufficient. It is not, which is why the upper passages have lately been lit with an economy bordering on severity. He straightened. How does such a disparity occur? Because preserved fruit is pleasant to order, my lord, and lamp oil is dull. Your late cousin dealt with household management much as some people deal with advice. He admired what was sweet, and avoided what was improving. That was unjust to good advice, but the mountain of sugar made objection difficult. They went next to the china cupboard, where Eliza opened one door onto a respectable display of dishes, and another onto the truth. Behind the better plates lurked a melancholy collection of cracked dishes, chipped soup bowls, and one platter broken so thoroughly that Edmund wondered why it had not been retired with dignity. Why are these kept? Because nobody had the authority to replace them properly, and because servants are ingenious, said Eliza. A cracked dish may still hold cold ham if one knows which side to turn toward the wall. Edmund regarded the cupboard in silence. I begin to suspect that my predecessor governed by whim. No, said Eliza. That would imply more consistency. He governed by appetite. From the pantry they went to the storeroom, where the confusion became mathematical. Edmund attempted to compare quantities, dates and orders while Eliza translated the habits of the household into plain speech. Too much sugar, too much candied peel, a surprising quantity of raisins, enough spice to suggest imperial ambition, not enough soap, not enough lamp oil, a dangerous uncertainty about candles, excellent tea purchased at an absurd cost, inferior coal bought cheaply and regretted ever since. At one point, Edmund paused over an entry. Why has the same supplier charged twice for nutmeg? Because he could, said Eliza. That is not an accounting principle. It is in the country, when people discover no one at the hall is checking. He looked up from the book. And was no one? Miss Harcourt gave him a level look. Does it appear to you that anyone was? There was very little to say to facts when they were presented so plainly. By the time they returned to the kitchen passage, Edmund's ideas of household management had suffered a blow from which they were unlikely ever entirely to recover. A great house, he saw now, was not one grand mechanism but 50 small arrangements, any one of which might fail for want of soap, honesty, or sense. Edmund was beginning to suspect that Halverton needed a steward almost as badly as it needed soap, though finding a trustworthy one seemed unlikely to be a morning's work. Eliza, watching him close the ledger with a face of chastened disbelief, decided that he was bearing the lesson rather better than most gentlemen would have done, which was fortunate, because they had not yet reached the soap. By the time they returned to the morning room, Edmund had acquired a notebook, a headache, and a new respect for soap. Surely these are not matters that ought to concern me, said Edmund. In any properly ordered house, the stores would be left to the housekeeper. They would, said Eliza. But in a properly ordered house, my lord, one does not generally find a large barrel of candied peel and a shortage of lamp oil. Miss Harcourt laid out 3 household lists, a pencilled column of proposed economies, and one alarmingly honest memorandum from Mrs. Wren. Edmund, taking his place opposite her, felt rather as though he had been invited to preside over his own correction. The obvious place to begin, he said, is unnecessary expenditure. How so? Said Eliza. He looked down the page. Candied peel, preserved cherries, imported sweetmeats, ornamental biscuits. Eliza glanced at the list. If you eliminate them entirely, Halverton Hall will become the first noble house in England to lose social standing through moral earnestness. It will at least save money, said Edmund. Yes, said Eliza, and no doubt Lady Fenwick will admire us all for taking plain biscuits in the dark. Edmund looked up. Lady Fenwick? Our nearest neighbour, said Eliza. Sir Lionel Fenwick's wife. They dine, visit, observe, and carry news in all the ordinary ways of civilized society. Sir Lionel is very much attached to appearances, she added. Lady Fenwick is attached to noticing them. Edmund considered that. You defend the candied peel with surprising warmth. I defend the principle, said Eliza, that not every visible pleasure is waste. He looked again at the list. Very well, we reduce the sweetmeats. We reduce the ordering of sweetmeats, she corrected. At present, the household could host a children's fete for a fortnight and still have enough sugar to keep the village in cakes for another. That was difficult to dispute. He moved to the next line. Then we cut extra coal deliveries. Eliza's brows rose. And freeze the upper floor. An excellent plan. Nothing improves servants like pneumonia. I did not say freeze them. No, gentlemen never do. They merely speak in economies until everyone else begins to shiver. Edmund leaned back and studied her. You have a very low opinion of gentlemen. Not low, merely experienced. And yet you continue to assist one. I am trying very hard not to make a habit of it. That answer was delivered with such composure that he laughed before he meant to. Eliza, who had plainly expected him to take offence, looked faintly surprised. Encouraged, he said. You appear to think me capable of every fashionable stupidity. No, she said, only the practical ones. He put a hand to the list. Then enlighten me. What do we cut? She leaned forward at once. All intelligence and purpose. Waste, vanity purchases, duplicate orders, expensive things bought because nobody wished to ask whether cheaper ones would do. We do not cut what keeps the house functioning. We cut what flatters the person ordering it. Edmund considered this. So my predecessor's taste for preserved cherries may be classified as vanity. With syrup, said Eliza. And candied peel? Edmund asked. With ambition, said Eliza. And what of the hothouse fruit? Her mouth twitched. Criminal optimism. That did it. He laughed outright, and Eliza, seeing it, very nearly joined him before seeming to remember that she was not here to enjoy herself, which, despite herself, she was beginning to do. The discussion went on. Soap must be bought properly. Better coal, though dearer, would save complaint and trouble alike. Cracked china might be replaced gradually. Lamp oil must be ordered at once. Candles must be counted by someone capable of both numbers and suspicion. The tenants' repairs could not be postponed merely because they were less decorative than the dessert table. To Edmund's surprise, the negotiations became enjoyable. She contradicted him with infuriating precision. He answered more sharply than was perhaps necessary, chiefly because he found he enjoyed the quick intelligence in her face when she answered him back. Miss Harcourt, for her part, seemed to take pleasure in watching him fail with dignity and recover with good humour. At last he said, "You are determined that I shall not govern this house by instinct." "Have you a domestic instinct?" said Eliza. "Certainly," said Edmund. "What is it?" she asked. "To be obeyed," he said. That brought her nearest yet to laughter. For one brief moment, the air between them altered. Eliza looked at him across the scattered lists, and Edmund saw the amusement in her face soften into something warmer and harder to dismiss. It made her suddenly lovely in a way that unsettled thought. He had the odd sensation that he had stepped a little too near the edge of something. She seemed to feel it too, for she lowered her eyes to the page and said, more quietly than before, "A house may survive many things, my lord. It rarely survives being governed for appearance alone." Edmund answered in the same tone, "Then it is fortunate I have been prevented from attempting it." Her fingers rested on the margin of the ledger. "I should not like Halverton to fail." "No," he said, "nor should I." They sat in silence for a moment, not awkwardly, but with a new awareness neither seemed ready to examine too closely. Then Eliza straightened, gathered the lists into order, and said in her brisker voice, "Well, we may at least save it from the candied peel." Edmund nodded gravely. A noble beginning. And as she rose to go, each carried away the same reluctant conclusion. That argument, in the wrong company, was exhausting, and in the right one, dangerously agreeable. Chapter 3. Cottages and Mud. 2 days later, under a sky the colour of old pewter, Edmund rode out with Miss Harcourt to inspect the estate and learn, as she put it, what his ledgers had been too mannerly to mention. The morning had begun with rain, and though it had eased, the lane beyond Halverton Hall was still soft with mud, the hedges damp, and the fields wore that patient, soaked look peculiar to the English countryside when it had been neglected by both sun and management. Edmund, in a dark riding coat, gloves and hat, had begun the expedition with polished boots and reasonable expectations. By the first gate, both had suffered. The gate itself hung crookedly on one hinge. Edmund dismounted, took hold of it, and discovered at once that it had been repaired at least twice by string, hope, and optimism wholly unsupported by carpentry. "This," he said, "cannot have been meant as a permanent solution." Eliza, in a sage walking dress, half boots already marked by the lane, and a bonnet tied firmly against the wind, regarded it with composure. "No," she said, "only the latest one." That, Edmund had begun to find, was characteristic of the estate. They went on. A stretch of wall had sunk where water had undermined it. One ditch had not been properly cleared. At the first tenant cottage, a row of slipped roof tiles left the eaves uneven, and smoke stains above the chimney marked a draught poor enough to trouble the room below. There was no drama in it, no grand collapse, only the slow discomfort of things left too long unattended. That, Edmund saw, was worse. Mrs. Ames received them at the first cottage with an apron still damp from washing. She dropped Edmund a curtsy and turned to Eliza with plain relief. "Miss Harcourt, I am glad to see you, miss." "And are you, Mrs. Ames," said Eliza. "How is your youngest?" "Coughing less, fortunately. though when the wind turns, the chimney sends half the fire back into the room. Edmund stepped inside and understood at once. The hearth smoked faintly even now. The room was neat, scrubbed and respectable, but there was a chill in it that should not have been there. A stool had been mended, a blanket had been patched. Everything spoke of care struggling against insufficiency. He looked up at the chimney breast. How long has this been going on? Mrs. Ames hesitated, as tenants do before speaking too plainly to landlords. Eliza answered for her. Since Michaelmas, at least. Mrs. Ames gave a reluctant nod. Something in Edmund settled uncomfortably. In London, neglect lived in paper. Here it lived in a child's lungs and a room that would not keep warm. They walked on to another cottage, where a roof leak had stained the wall beside the bed, and then to a third, where the garden fence had partly gone and the hens wandered with more liberty than safety. At each stop, Eliza knew the names, the ailments, the practical facts, and the small dignities of the people before them. She did not pity them noisily. She asked after mothers, rents, fuel, and cabbages with equal seriousness, which appeared to be exactly what was wanted. By the time they turned back toward the lane, Edmund had stopped thinking of the estate as an abstraction. He looked over the cottages, the poor repairs, the damp verges, the labouring fields, and understood at last that mismanagement was not theatrical, it was cumulative. A slipped tile, a bad chimney, a hanging gate, a bill not paid, a repair delayed until somebody else had to live with the consequence. Beside him, Eliza said nothing for a little while. Then, more quietly than usual, she asked, "Did you expect ruin?" Edmund glanced at her. "Yes," he said after a moment. "Something more visible, less easily mistaken for inconvenience." She nodded. Neglect is seldom grand enough to announce itself. It only goes on making people colder. The observation was too just to be answered at once. And because she seemed not to require one, they walked on together through the muddy lane in a silence more companionable than either would have expected. They reached the rise beyond the Ames cottage, where the ground lifted enough to show 3 tenant roofs, one leaning fence, and a field boundary that had surrendered to weather and livestock in equal measure. Eliza stopped and turned with the air of a woman about to begin a lesson she had no intention of making charming. "The roof at the Porter cottage must be done first," she said, "not because it is most visible, but because water has already reached the bedchamber wall. Leave it another month, and the timber will begin to answer back." Edmund was silent a moment. "And the chimney?" "Second. A broken roof is obvious. A bad chimney does its harm more slowly. People grow used to smoke until it becomes illness." He glanced back toward the cottages. "And the gate?" "The gate may wait a week, though not much longer. Mr. Ames mends what he can, but if his cow strays onto Fenwick land, there will be trouble." Edmund absorbed this in silence. Eliza had grown accustomed to gentlemen receiving practical matters with polite indifference. She therefore found his next question unexpectedly to the point. "What can be done at once," he asked, "with the labour we already have?" She looked at him. "The chimney," she said. "Jenkins can manage it if someone sees that he does not put it off. The gate needs rehanging, but not new timber. The roof requires tiles, and someone must speak to Mr. Mason before he promises them elsewhere." Edmund nodded. "And if materials are short?" "They are short," said Eliza, "which is why one cannot afford to choose badly." He accepted this without argument. Then what ought never to be postponed? That, she thought, was a better question than most landlords ever reached. "Anything touching heat, water, roofs, or food," she said. "People may endure shabby curtains indefinitely. They do not thrive under leaks." He smiled faintly. "You have a very poor opinion of curtains." "I have a practical one," she replied. They began to walk again, more slowly now, while she pointed out the chain by which one small neglect became 3 others. A slipped tile meant damp. Damp meant sickness, spoiled bedding, fires that smoked, linen that would not dry, tempers shortened by cold, and money spent in the wrong place because the right place had been ignored earlier. He listened, not politely, not with the strained patience of a man waiting for his turn to improve upon what he had just heard. He listened as though the information mattered and might alter what he did next. "Eliza, noticing this, felt a small and inconvenient shift in her opinion of him. He asked where the carpenter could be relied upon and where he could not, which tenants paid steadily and which were one poor season away from trouble, whether the cottages near the low ground were always damp in spring, which repairs would restore confidence as well as comfort. He did not once interrupt to explain the countryside to a woman who had lived in it all her life, which alone placed him among the more remarkable of his sex. At the bend in the lane they paused while a cart passed, its wheels dragging in mud. Edmund said, "If I set the house in order first and neglect this, I shall look well to visitors and very ill to my tenants." Eliza's mouth moved. "In a village, that is considerably worse." He glanced at her then, and there was something in his expression warmer than amusement and steadier than embarrassment. "You knew I should have to see this myself. So you brought me." "Yes." He looked over the cottages once more. "You were right." Eliza had been right too often of late to take much pleasure in it, yet hearing him say so plainly touched her more than she wished. It was not merely humility, it was trust beginning to learn where it belonged. She drew her gloves a little tighter. "Do not look so noble, my lord. We have not yet reached the ditch." "I should be sorry to meet the ditch unprepared," Edmund laughed, and together they went on along the lane, speaking now less like opponents and more like allies deciding where duty ought to begin. By the time they left the last cottage, it had begun to rain in earnest. "It will pass," said Eliza, in a tone suggesting hope rather than belief. It did not pass. They made a valiant attempt to return on horseback, but the lane had grown slick and the rain sharper, and when they reached the village inn, Edmund insisted upon leaving the horses there and hiring a carriage for the journey home. There was no elegance in the change. There was mud, damp leather, a driver with the look of a martyr, and a stable boy who nearly lost one boot in the mud. At last they were inside, seated opposite one another while the carriage lurched forward over the soaked road. The small enclosed space altered everything. Wet wool, damp gloves, and the steady sound of wheels through mud created a kind of unwilling intimacy. The windows were misted at the corners. Rain ticked against the glass. Eliza loosened her gloves and set them beside her, then immediately wished she had not, as it made the scene feel absurdly domestic. Edmund removed his hat and sat back, one hand braced against the sway of the carriage. His dark riding coat had taken the rain with less grace than his dignity, and a drop of water still clung near his collar. The damp had darkened his hair at the temples, softening by a degree the careful composure she had begun to think natural to him. That too was inconvenient. "I hope," he said, "that this expedition has not ruined your good opinion of country management." Eliza glanced up. "I had not one." That won the ghost of a smile. "No? Only of certain people attempting it. And how do I stand among them?" She considered him, because he had asked seriously. "Improved," she said. "You listened." "I am glad to know my accomplishments have become so dazzling." "In some gentlemen," said Eliza, "listening is an accomplishment in itself." He laughed softly, then looked down at the gloves in his hand. They were good gloves, fine enough for town, though now dampened and stained at the edges. His hands themselves were elegant, long-fingered, carefully kept, yet there was ink caught faintly along one finger. Eliza noticed it at once. It made him look less ornamental and more real. She found herself wondering how many letters he wrote in a week, how many estate papers he had already attempted to order, how often he had sat alone at a desk since inheriting all this confusion and tried to make sense of it before discovering that sense was not to be had on paper alone. "You write a great many letters," she said before she could think better of it. He looked faintly surprised. "Is it so evident?" She glanced toward his hand. "Only to anyone observant." He followed her gaze and gave a brief, almost embarrassed laugh. "I had an uncle who maintained that a gentleman's fingers should show either ink or horseflesh, or else he was of no use to himself or anybody else." That is a surprisingly sensible sentiment. He was a surprisingly sensible man, which is perhaps why he was not much liked. The carriage rocked over a rut. Eliza caught at the strap beside her. Edmund leaned forward instinctively, then stopped when he saw she was steady. The moment passed, though not entirely. Rain beat harder against the glass. Outside was all grey field, hedge and water. Inside was quiet. Eliza said, more softly, "You did not know what you would find here." "No. And yet you came." He looked at her then with a seriousness that left no room for lightness. "It was mine to come to." The answer was simple. Because it was simple, it struck her more than anything finer might have done. She had known men who spoke readily of duty when duty required nothing but speech. Edmund Pembroke had ridden through mud to inspect bad chimneys, listened to plain facts, and admitted ignorance without becoming absurd about it. It was not brilliance, it was something rarer, it was steadiness. He said, after a moment, "Did you expect me to be worse?" Eliza's mouth curved despite herself. "I expected you to be grander." "And am I a disappointment?" She looked at his damp coat, his muddied boots, the ink stain on his finger, and the expression of real inquiry in his eyes. "No," she said. Something in the carriage shifted then. Not dramatically, not dangerously, but enough that both of them felt it. Neither looked away at once. When they did, it was with the faint sense that the silence between them had changed, and would not easily become ordinary again. By the time Halverton Hall came into view through the rain, both had recovered their composure, but not entirely. Chapter 4. Dinner for 12. At Halverton Hall, calm never lasted long. The moment things improved, society turned up. Edmund had planned a modest dinner for 12. The Fenwicks, the rector and his wife from the next parish, he being a sanctimonious man who spoke of humility with unusual satisfaction. Eliza's father, Mr. Harcourt, the local vicar, with his wife and daughter, two neighbouring ladies who liked to inspect other people's housekeeping under cover of civility. One gentleman who had never met a horse, hound or hunting story he could not tell at length, and enough other local respectability to fill the table without improving it. It ought to have been easy. Instead, by 3 o'clock the fish had not arrived. One footman was feverish. The second best table linen had been sent up in place of the first, and Mrs. Biddle was in a state of personal offence against the whole order of things. Edmund received these developments in his study with the composure of a man who knew that showing alarm before servants was useless as well as undignified. "Is the fish truly not here?" he asked. "Not unless it has learned invisibility, my lord," said Mr. Pritchard. "And Harris?" "In bed, my lord." "With what?" "Heat, sore throat, and a conviction that he shall not live till morning. He cannot be above 20. "Yes, my lord. It seems not to have encouraged him." Edmund closed his eyes briefly. "Very well. Let him have broth, and if the fever rises, send for the apothecary. And if the fish arrives, I should like to be informed before midnight." Pritchard bowed and withdrew with the air of a man leaving another to his fate. Within minutes Eliza was in the room. She had changed already for the evening, though not entirely. Her hair was dressed more carefully than usual, but she still wore a plain working apron over the pale grey gown beneath, as if she had dressed for the evening without entirely surrendering the day's work. A satin ribbon at her waist had come slightly loose. She looked brisk, handsome, and entirely unromantic in the act of rescuing dinner. "The fish is delayed," she said. "The linen is wrong. Harris cannot stand. Mrs. Biddle says she will not answer for the sauce if the kitchen boy cries over the onions again." Edmund rose at once. "What is most urgent?" Eliza looked at him sharply, and he had the odd impression that he had just passed some small test without being told he had been set one. "The linen first," she said. "If Lady Fenwick sees mismatched napkins, she will discuss the decline of Halverton until Christmas. The fish next, if only to determine whether we must pretend we never expected it. Harris may be replaced if someone can be trusted not to drop soup on a baronet." "Can anyone?" "Not confidently." They went out together. Halverton Hall in the hour before dinner was less a house than a campaign. Servants crossed passages at speed, doors opened and shut, coal scuttles clattered through the passages. Mrs. Wren was in the dining room, restoring order to the table with the concentrated expression of a general reclaiming lost ground. Eliza moved through it all with swift authority. "No, Not those candles, the better pair. Jenkins, if you lean the fire screen another inch it will fall on Lady Fenwick. Sarah, take the lavender from the blue bowl and put it in the smaller vase. We are not burying anyone. Edmund, in evening clothes now, dark coat, white waistcoat, immaculate linen, and an expression of grave resolve, found himself trying to catch instructions as they flew past. Pritchard, he said, put Martin in Harris's place and give Collins the door. Collins is nervous with introductions, my lord. Then he shall be nervous quietly. Yes, my lord. Their paths crossed again in the hall. The fish? Edmund asked. Still absent. The linen? Improving. The cook? Elaborate but hostile. That may be her natural state. It is. Unfortunately, she is now exerting it. Edmund ought not to have enjoyed any part of this. Yet there was something in the speed of it, the practical urgency, the sense that he and Eliza were no longer debating management, but performing it side by side, which stirred him more agreeably than any formal triumph could have done. Then a kitchen maid came skidding into the passage, stopped at sight of Edmund as though she had run into authority itself, and gasped. Miss Harcourt, cook says if the sauce breaks now she'll have nobody blamed but the onion boy and human folly. Eliza shut her eyes for one brief moment. I am coming. She turned toward the kitchen. Edmund followed. You need not, she began. I very much think I do. My lord, the kitchen is not a place in which rank improves anything. Then I shall enter on my personal merits. That is a reckless proposal. Desperation has impaired my judgment. She made a sound that might have been annoyance, and might, with charity, have been the beginning of laughter. The kitchens of Halverton Hall were hot, bright, and loud with purposeful distress. Firelight struck the copper pans. Steam rose from pots. A boy at the table chopped herbs with the concentrated misery of one who suspected they had all been cut wrongly. The air smelled of browning butter, stock, roasting meat, warm bread, and female indignation. At the centre of it all stood Mrs. Biddle. She had a spoon in one hand, a cloth in the other, and the air of a woman prepared to carry civilization on her shoulders if fools would kindly cease jostling her while she did it. She saw Edmund and stared. Then she said, Good gracious! Every servant in sight seemed to stop breathing. Eliza did not. My lord has come to be useful, she said. Mrs. Biddle looked Edmund over from polished shoe to well-tied cravat with the deep suspicion of one considering whether the world had begun making jokes in earnest. Has he indeed? I hope so, said Edmund. Mrs. Biddle thrust a folded cloth into his hands. Then take those heated plates to the passage and mind your fingers. If they're dropped, I shall know despair in this life. Edmund took the cloth. For one startled second, he stood holding it with the look of a man who had not expected to be handed orders in his own kitchen. Eliza, already moving to the stove, looked back over her shoulder. Well, my lord, the plates will not respect the peerage. A sound escaped from somewhere among the scullery maids and was immediately smothered. Edmund, finding himself the object of an entire kitchen's horrified attention, did the only thing left to him. He obeyed. He carried the plates. He discovered at once that they were far hotter than rank had prepared him to expect. He set them down where directed, narrowly avoided burning his thumb through the cloth, and turned in time to be sent for parsley, then told to move aside for a boy with gravy, then ordered by Mrs. Biddle herself to hold a platter steady while she corrected an arrangement of garnish with the speed and fury of an avenging spirit. At no point did anyone thank him. At last the fish arrived. At one point Mrs. Biddle said, Not there, my lord, unless you mean to serve the fish from the floor. At present, Edmund replied, adjusting his grip, I mean only to preserve its dignity. That won him, from somewhere behind the pies, a muffled snort of approval. Eliza was at the stove with her sleeves rolled one careful turn above the wrist, rescuing what had once been a perilous sauce and was now, by art and force, returning to respectability. The heat had brought colour to her cheeks. A loosened curl had escaped near her temple. She looked entirely absorbed, entirely competent, and, to Edmund's increasing inconvenience, more lovely than many women did after an hour spent dressing for admiration. Mrs. Biddle seized a tasting spoon, considered the sauce, and narrowed her eyes. "It lives," she announced. "Then dinner may proceed," said Eliza. Mrs. Biddle pointed her spoon at Edmund. "You, Earl or no Earl, if you're standing there idle again, take those patties through before they die waiting." As Edmund turned with the tray of patties, marmalade wound round his ankles with the air of a creature entirely certain that kitchens, fires, and fish existed chiefly for his comfort. "Do not step on marmalade," said Eliza without looking up from the sauce. "I had no intention of stepping on anyone," Edmund returned, recovering both balance and dignity with difficulty. "He does not recognize rank," said Eliza. "I begin to find that a common household failing," he remarked dryly. Mrs. Biddle from the stove said, "He recognizes salmon, my lord, which is more useful." By the time he looked round again, the sauce had been saved, the onion boy no longer looked on the verge of collapse, and half the kitchen seemed to have accepted the astonishing fact that the Earl of Halverton could carry hot dishes without collapsing into ceremonial ash. As Edmund stepped aside for a maid bearing a tray of glasses, he heard one scullery girl whisper to another, in tones of shocked wonder, "It's the Earl in the kitchen!" The other, more practical, hissed back, "Then mind the cream and don't stare." Eliza heard it too. Her eyes flickered to his for one instant, and something warm and amused moved in them before she turned away again. That single look pleased him absurdly. When the last emergency had been handled, stirred, or marched out toward possible respectability, Eliza crossed to him, lowered her voice and said, "You had better go and finish being noble. Your guests will arrive in 15 minutes, and at present you smell faintly of fish." Edmund looked down at himself. "This is a serious charge." "It is also true." "I had hoped," he said, glancing at his cuffs, "to reappear as the master of the house, not as a suspicious addition to the supper." Edmund glanced at her. "And you?" "I shall remain here until Mrs. Biddle believes dinner may still be served." Mrs. Biddle from the stove said, "I believe in dinner. It's people I mistrust." That nearly ruined Eliza's composure. She turned away too quickly to hide the laugh, and Edmund, seeing it, thought he had never liked any room in Halverton Hall so much as this furious kitchen lit by fire, steam, and her presence. Still, she was right. There was no leisure for reflection. Halverton Hall had 12 dinners to serve, one reputation to defend, and no intention whatever of accomplishing either without resistance. By some combination of determination, concealment, and rare good fortune, dinner was not merely served. It was served well. The guests arrived in proper order, carrying damp hems, polished manners, and appetites sharpened by the weather. Lady Fenwick entered first, as if by right of scrutiny. Sir Lionel Fenwick followed with the smooth composure of a man who had never in his life doubted that fish would appear when summoned. Collins, at the door, announced Mrs. Darnley as Mrs. Danvers, corrected himself at once, and spent the rest of the arrivals looking like a man expecting execution. Edmund received them with the calm distinction expected of an earl in possession of his house, which was particularly creditable because half an hour earlier he had been in the kitchen passage carrying patties under cook's authority. Eliza had vanished before the first carriage rolled up. She reappeared only when the company moved toward dinner, transformed from useful ally into something much less easy to regard calmly. Her gown was pale grey muslin with a satin ribbon, simple enough in design, yet candlelight had adopted it with enthusiasm. She took her place without fuss, as though she had not spent the afternoon rescuing silver, servants, sauces, and one titled gentleman from practical uselessness. Edmund, who knew exactly what the evening had cost, found this faintly astonishing. The first course entered. Clear soup, bright with herbs and steaming gently in the porcelain, went down the table like a promise honourably kept. No one looking at it would have guessed that the kitchen boy had nearly wept into the onions at 4 o'clock. It was followed by the fish at last. Late, yes, but presentable, with a delicate sauce so well recovered from danger that even Mrs. Biddle might have forgiven the world for 10 minutes. Lady Fenwick tasted, paused, and gave the smallest nod. From her, it amounted to applause. Edmund allowed himself one inward breath of relief. The next dishes arrived in good order. roast fowl with crisp skin and rich juices, carved neatly and served hot, buttered carrots, tender peas, soft rolls with shining crusts that yielded at once when broken. There was ham glazed to a modest sheen and a savoury tart, which Sir Lionel praised with more warmth than intelligence. The wine was respectable. The plates all arrived intact. No servant dropped anything irreversible upon an innocent guest. The sporting gentleman had reached dogs before the soup and horses before the fish, and seemed unlikely to improve. Mrs. Harcourt was speaking softly to Lady Fenwick, while Mr. Harcourt bore the rector from the next parish, with the mild patience of a man long accustomed to lesser local trials. More remarkably still, the room began to enjoy itself. Conversation loosened. Even the rector's wife, who usually spoke as though balancing delicacy against disapproval, accepted a second helping of carrots. Sir Lionel remarked upon the improvement of the hall. Lady Fenwick, glancing once at the candles and once at the table linen, said only, "Very comfortable," which from her amounted to public absolution. Hearing it, Edmund looked almost involuntarily down the table toward Eliza. She had just accepted a glass of wine from the footman, and was speaking to Mrs. Darnley on her left with perfect composure, as if she had not an hour earlier stood over a threatened sauce in a kitchen full of firelight and panic. There was colour in her face from the warmth of the room, and a brightness in her eyes that candlelight seemed eager to claim. If she felt his glance, she did not show it, but after a moment she looked up, only briefly. Still, something in her expression altered, as though she too had marked the evening's steadiness and taken a quiet satisfaction in it. Dessert came on with all the elegance of a household more prosperous than Halverton had any present right to pretend. A moulded cream, pale and trembling on its dish, candied orange peel bright as jewels on porcelain, preserved cherries shining richly in their syrup. The sweet things that had lately seemed evidence of absurdity now looked almost festive, because they were offered with measure and sense. What had looked absurd in the stores looked graceful enough on the table. That, Edmund thought, was very like Miss Harcourt's method in all things. He found himself smiling, which he disguised by reaching for his wine. Across the room, beyond the open door, servants passed and repassed with the smooth, exhausted efficiency of those who knew they had won and meant not to celebrate until the last plate was down. Course by course, Halverton Hall had ceased to look precarious and begun to look merely accomplished. And beneath all the evening's polish lay the far more satisfying truth. It had been accomplished by work, judgment, and an alarming quantity of will. The wobble came with the second dessert course and wore the shape of Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins, elevated that evening from uncertainty to responsibility, entered with a tray of delicate syllabub glasses and the fixed expression of a man who had placed his soul in careful balance with the crystal. He might have succeeded too, had Sir Lionel not chosen that precise moment to lean back his chair and interrupt the footman's path with one elegantly useless leg. There followed the sort of pause in which disaster gathers itself. A glass tilted. Another trembled. Edmund, from the head of the table, saw Collins blanch to the colour of unmixed cream. Then Eliza moved. No one could afterward have said precisely how. She was halfway through answering Lady Fenwick on the subject of Bath waters, and in the next instant she had risen just enough to catch the edge of the tray, steady Collins with one hand, and say, in a tone calm enough to shame panic itself, "Collins, I think that belongs a little more to the left." Collins obeyed as if she had restored him by occult means. The glasses steadied, only one spoon was lost. Sir Lionel, who had caused the difficulty and noticed it only in its conclusion, said, "Ah," and drew in his leg with the air of a man making a social concession. The room breathed again. Edmund, whose own hand had tightened on his wineglass, set it down carefully and resumed conversation with the rector as if nothing had occurred. For all his outward composure, he had just watched his household's reputation come within an inch of collapsing into cream. The rector spoke at some length on the virtue of moderation, while accepting a second helping of syllabub. After that, the evening held. The ladies withdrew, the gentlemen lingered no longer than decency required. Sir Lionel offered a smooth remark on the comfort of Halverton Hall. Lady Fenwick pronounced the dinner extremely well judged. which from her was praise of the highest order. Carriages were called, cloaks were found, and final courtesies exchanged. At last, the house exhaled. The hall was full of the agreeable disorder that follows a successful evening. Servants retrieving wraps, guests rediscovering gloves, and the faint draught of the open door bringing in cold night air from the sweep beyond. Mr. Harcourt was searching with mild distraction for one glove. Mrs. Harcourt was submitting to having her cloak fastened, and Eliza stood beside them in her pale gown, her own cloak not yet brought up. Candlelight caught the satin ribbon at her waist. She looked composed again, as if she had spent the evening doing nothing more exacting than receiving compliments and passing the salt. Edmund thought this a highly misleading appearance. For a moment he stood looking at her across the movement of cloaks and servants. Then he crossed to the Harcourts. "I hope," he said to Mrs. Harcourt, "that Halverton has not disgraced itself tonight." Mrs. Harcourt smiled. "On the contrary, my lord, we have been very well entertained." "Extremely well judged," said Lady Fenwick from somewhere behind them, on her way to the door, and passed on before anyone could ask more of her. Eliza's eyes met Edmund's for one brief instant. He said quietly, "Then I must consider the evening a historic event." "Yes," said Eliza, "along with the survival of the fish." "That did it." Edmund laughed. Not loudly, but helplessly enough that Eliza, seeing it, had to look down a moment before laughing too. The sound of it, soft and quickly checked, seemed far more dangerous than either of them had any business permitting. "Poor Collins," Edmund said under his breath. "Poor Syllabub," Eliza returned. "And Sir Lionel," he added, whose leg very nearly brought the Syllabub to grief. "I own," said Eliza, "that I should not have found it wholly tragic." He looked at her. "Miss Harcourt." "My lord." "You are vindictive." "Only where deserved." Her father turned then, his glove at last recovered. "Eliza, my dear." "Yes, papa." She took the cloak a servant offered her. Edmund himself reached to settle it more securely at her shoulders, before he had quite thought better of doing so. For one moment his hands touched the folds of her dark collar, and she stood very still. "You were very good this evening," she said, more softly now. Edmund lifted a brow. "Good?" "Yes. You submitted to direction with admirable restraint." "That is severe praise." "It is accurate praise. I shall treasure it." The corner of her mouth lifted. "Do." The ordinary world pressed in again, a servant opening the door, Lady Fenwick calling for her shawl, Sir Lionel asking whether his carriage had been brought round, and Mr. Sibley still saying something earnest about a grey hunter nobody had the strength to follow. Mr. Harcourt, with the mild patience of a clergyman long accustomed to earthly confusion, thanked Edmund for an excellent dinner. Mrs. Harcourt added her gratitude with warmer feeling. Eliza gave him her hand. "Good night, my lord." He bowed over it. "Good night, Miss Harcourt." And as he watched her go out with her parents into the candle-lit dark, Edmund had the distinct and inconvenient sense that Halverton Hall was less alive without her in it. Chapter 5. First Nearness. The morning after the dinner broke soft and pale over Halverton Hall. Eliza came down earlier than she meant to. Mrs. Wren had mentioned, the night before, that several pots in the greenhouse had been neglected during the worst of the household confusion. Eliza, who could never hear of drooping leaves without wanting to inspect them, went by the garden before breakfast. She expected to find old Barnes muttering over mildew. Instead, when she opened the greenhouse door, she found the Earl of Halverton in shirt-sleeves, a pair of gardening shears in one hand, and a streak of clay on the cuff of his white shirt. She stopped on the threshold. The greenhouse was already warm. Moisture gleamed on the glass. Pots of rosemary, geranium, and myrtle stood in neat rows. A lemon tree filled one corner with glossy leaves. Along the far wall, roses were being coaxed, with visible effort, toward a second flowering. The air smelled of damp earth, citrus, and green stems newly cut. Marmalade lay in a broad patch of sun near Edmund's feet, one eye half open. A saucer stood beside him whose purpose was easy enough to guess. Edmund looked up at once. For a moment he seemed as surprised as she was. Then he straightened and set the shears on the bench. Miss Harcourt. I had not expected an audience. Her eyes dropped, quite against her will, to the line of his forearm where the linen was turned back. It was very provoking that an earl should look better in partial disorder than most men did in perfect arrangement. I see, she said, recovering herself, that Halverton Hall contains more marvels than I had been led to suppose. Because I have assaulted a rosebush before breakfast? No. Because Marmalade appears to have accepted you. Edmund glanced down at the cat. I bribed him with cream. Then he has judged you by an excellent principle, she said. Old Barnes, bent over a row of seed trays, gave a grunt that might have been approval. His lordship knows what he is about, miss. Better than some who have called themselves gardeners these 20 years. Eliza turned toward him. You astonish me too, Mr. Barnes. I had thought you disapproved of nearly everyone. I do, said Barnes. Saves time. Edmund laughed. It was quiet, but it altered his whole face. She had seen him amused before, though usually in resistance, as if he preferred to keep such things under discipline. Here, in the green warmth, it was easier to imagine him unguarded. He lifted a small terracotta pot from the bench and examined the roots of something tender and green. Barnes informs me, he said, that this poor creature was nearly done for by misplaced kindness. Barnes sniffed. The boy drowned the roots, scorched the leaves, and called it care. Edmund turned to Eliza with grave concern. A dangerous philosophy. It was foolish, she said, stepping nearer. Even I know enough to say so. That is reassuring. I had begun to think I was single-handedly endangering the whole establishment. She gave him a look. At present, you are endangering a potting bench and a lemon tree. Then I am glad the consequences are local. She ought not to have smiled. She did it anyway. He set the pot down with great care. That caught her attention more than any display would have done. There was no flourish in him. He handled each stem as though damage, once done, need not be added to. A few cuttings lay on the bench beside twine, stakes, moss, and a notebook open to several neat lines. Eliza noticed it. You have made a list. I generally do. Of flowers? Of what is ailing, what may be saved, what must be moved, and what Barnes will tell me I have misunderstood. Likely true, Barnes muttered. Eliza drew off her gloves and laid them on the bench. You are very methodical, my lord. That observation has been made before. Not always kindly. I dare say it has often been made by people who benefited from it. His gaze rested on her face. That sounds dangerously like kindness. Do not be absurd. I am only being accurate. Then I shall value it all the more. To hide the faint warmth that answer stirred in her, she moved toward a row of pale pink roses and touched one bloom lightly with the back of her fingers. I had not understood you cared for gardens. My mother cared for them, Edmund said. I was merely educated under compulsion. That answer, offered so simply, made her turn. He had taken up the shears again. Sunlight through the glass fell across his dark hair and the clean line of his cheek. Without his coat, without the visible armor of polished propriety, he seemed younger and more himself. I cannot picture anyone compelling you, Eliza said. My mother managed it with great ease. She was a small woman with a soft voice, which taught me early that outward appearance is a poor guide to power. Eliza laughed aloud, and Barnes, apparently satisfied that no immediate disaster threatened his seedlings, rose with a grunt and carried a tray toward the far end of the greenhouse. The shift was slight. It was impossible not to feel it. Edmund touched a damaged stem with one finger. My mother disliked waste in a garden. She used to say it punished a living thing twice over. First by neglect, and then by impatience. His voice had changed. Not much. It had simply gone quieter, as though the memory itself required room. She taught you all this? She taught me enough to be useful when ordered, and enough to understand how much depends upon patience. He glanced at the roses. Some plants resent fussing. They do better if one watches them properly, then leaves them alone. Eliza smiled faintly. Excellent advice for roses. It might also serve for half the people in this county. Only half? He said with a laugh. At most, she replied. He leaned one hand on the bench. My mother liked the old striped roses best. They looked untidy in a formal border which pleased her. My father preferred things in lines. She preferred them alive. There was affection in that memory, but also a grief so settled it no longer required a name. To her surprise, Eliza found she wanted to hear more. Was she like anyone else in your family? She asked. My aunt, Lady Agnes, in part, he said. She has the same strength, though she generally applies it to greater effect. The answer struck Eliza as both loyal and exact. She did not say so. Instead, she traced a fingertip along the rim of an empty pot. You speak of her as though she made every place gentler. She did, Edmund said. Then, after a moment, though she was perfectly capable of terrifying the idle. That is a relief, she said. A woman too good for the world is no use in life. His expression altered with amusement. A severe standard, but a necessary one, she replied. The warmth in the greenhouse had deepened. Sunlight lay bright across the tiled floor. Eliza moved toward the citrus trees and paused beside one whose leaves had yellowed at the edges. I think this one wants feeding, she said. Edmund glanced at the yellowing leaves. You sound certain. Eliza touched one of the yellowing leaves. My sister Lucy once nearly killed a potted orange in exactly that manner. She wept over it, apologized to it, and forgot to water it again the following week. His mouth shifted. That is a very particular kind of devotion. Yes, Eliza said. She loves everything warmly. She does not always remember to love it regularly. That must make her charming, Edmund said. It makes her easy to forgive, Eliza answered. He was quiet for a moment. And you, he said, are you easy to forgive? The question startled her, not because it was improper, because it was personal in a way their conversations had seldom been. I do not know, she said. No one has taken the trouble to inform me. Edmund looked at her. I cannot believe that. It is true enough. She kept her eyes on the leaves. I am generally the person who remembers what must be done, who has been overlooked, and what will happen if no one attends to it. Such people are useful. They are thanked sincerely and forgotten with ease. She had not meant to say so much. A flush rose in her cheeks. She turned a little away. You must excuse me. That sounded peevish. It sounded tired, Edmund said. The quiet force of that reply kept her from dismissing it. She looked back at him. He had not moved closer, which somehow made the sympathy in his expression easier to bear. There is a difference, he added. Eliza tried for lightness and failed. I suppose one may be both. Yes, he said, one may. No grand declaration could have touched her half so much as that simple agreement. She set her hand on the rim of a nearby pot. I am tired of being dependable, she said, so softly she might almost have denied it afterward. Sometimes people are so relieved I will manage a difficulty that it never occurs to them to ask whether I wish to carry it. The silence that followed was not empty. It held him listening. At last he said, It is a wearying thing to be valued chiefly where one is useful. I do know something of that. She looked up. You? He gave the smallest smile. In a different way. But yes. She had never thought of rank as its own burden. Yet as he stood there with earth on his cuff and morning light in his hair, he seemed farther than ever from the idea of effortless privilege. She wondered how often he had been admired for title, position, and expectation, and not for his own mind, his own temper, his own particular kindnesses. I am sorry, she said. His expression warmed. Thank you. No one had moved. No one had touched the other. Yet the space between them had changed. A small task broke the stillness before it could become too revealing. Edmund reached for a pot set high on the rear shelf, half hidden behind a fern. If Barnes sees that left there much longer, he said, he will accuse the household of conspiracy. Eliza glanced up. You will upset the whole arrangement. I shall do no such thing. He stretched higher. She moved a step nearer. You are already doing it. "I have it," Edmund said. He did not. Eliza moved without thinking, stepping close to catch its base before it tipped against the bench. In the same instant, Edmund turned and reached down. His hand closed over hers around the warm clay. Everything stopped. Their fingers did not properly entwine. His hand lay over hers only because the pot was between them, yet she felt it everywhere. The greenhouse seemed suddenly too warm. The scent of earth and roses deepened until it was almost dizzying. She was aware of the heat of his skin through her glove, of the nearness of his chest, of the fact that if she raised her eyes fully, she would meet his face at a distance no sensible woman invited. Neither of them let go. Eliza became conscious that one escaped curl had come loose near her temple. She knew it because his gaze flickered there for an instant and returned, with visible effort, to her eyes. "I stand corrected," Edmund said, his voice low now, roughened at the edges. "You prevented a disaster." She ought to have answered with something light. Some dry reply presented itself and vanished at once. "It was only a geranium," she said at last. "A valuable life," he returned. At length he released the pot, though not abruptly. His fingers brushed the side of her hand as they withdrew. Edmund took the plant from her with exaggerated care and set it on the bench between them, as though both of them required the distance of an ordinary object. "There," he said. "Yes," Eliza answered, though she was no longer certain what either of them meant. He looked away first, and in that brief movement of self-command, she liked him more than ever. A vain man would have used such a moment. A careless man would have spoilt it. Edmund seemed instead to feel its weight and honour it by restraint. To hide her confusion, Eliza reached for her gloves. "I should go," she said. He moved ahead of her and held the greenhouse door open. The garden beyond looked cooler than it had before. At the threshold she paused. "I am glad you were here this morning," she said. He answered at once. "So am I." She raised her eyes then, and whatever she saw in his face made any further remark impossible. So she inclined her head and stepped out into the bright morning air. As she crossed the path toward the house, she was acutely conscious of two things. First, that she had learned something unexpected and dear about him among the rosepots and damp tiles of a greenhouse. Second, that no lecture she had ever given herself on good sense was likely to be of the slightest use now. Behind her, the greenhouse door closed with gentle care. All that day, whether she stood in the still room measuring sugar, sat with Mrs. Wren over household linen, or listened to Lucy speak rapturously of entirely unrelated matters, Eliza carried the memory of his hand over hers, and the look in his eyes when neither of them had known how to move away. It was a very inconvenient memory. It was also, she thought, the loveliest one she had yet possessed. Chapter 6. Dangerous Attention. Lady Agnes Pembroke arrived at Halverton Hall on a clear afternoon with two trunks, a maid, a pug of doubtful temper, and an air that suggested the house ought to consider itself improved by being observed. The carriage had scarcely stopped before Mr. Pritchard was at the steps, with all the gravity of state business, and two footmen were moving with a speed they had not displayed all week. In the hall, everything wore an air of sudden discipline. Even the flowers in the blue and white china jars seemed, by some mystery, to hold themselves more upright. Eliza, who had come only to ask whether the blue saloon fire should be laid earlier against the evening chill, heard the wheels on the gravel and knew at once who must have arrived. Lucy, her younger sister, had come with her from the vicarage under the respectable pretext of returning a book to Mrs. Wren, though curiosity was plainly the stronger motive. She clasped her hands. "Do you suppose she is dreadful?" "No," Eliza said. "Only perceptive." "That sounds worse. In many cases it is." The front door opened. Lady Agnes entered with the ease of a woman who had spent her life crossing thresholds that belonged, if not to her, then at least to people too sensible to obstruct her. She was dressed for travel in a deep plum pelisse trimmed with dark braid, a rich bonnet tied beneath her chin, and gloves that suggested a woman not accustomed to disorder. Her gaze moved once around the hall. It took in the polished but worn floor, the fresh flowers, The runner on the stairs, Mr. Pritchard's exact posture, Lucy's open curiosity, and Eliza's presence in the space of a breath. Then she said, "Edmund, I am relieved, the house has not fallen down." Edmund, who had come forward to receive her, bent over her hand with dutiful affection. "I did my utmost to preserve the roof until your arrival." "A wise beginning," said Lady Agnes. "A house may survive ugly walls, a roof is another matter." Her eyes passed to the nearest arrangement of roses and white stocks. "A new arrangement, I see." "It is," Edmund said. "And not your doing, I think." "No," Edmund replied, with perfect calm. "I have had assistance." Lady Agnes turned fully toward Eliza, her handsome face composed, her intelligent gaze steady, and her manner entirely without haste. "Miss Harcourt, I believe." Eliza curtsied. "Lady Agnes. I have heard your name 3 times in the last 4 letters from my nephew. That is already enough to interest me." Lucy made a small sound. Eliza said, without looking at her. "Lucy." "I said nothing." "You never do. Your face undertakes the labour." Edmund's mouth twitched. Lady Agnes noticed the exchange between them and looked faintly satisfied. "My aunt enjoys alarming people," he said. "Only those who have been overpraised for their steadiness," Lady Agnes returned. "It is good for them." She offered Eliza 2 fingers. "Come, walk me through this hall and tell me whether the house is improving because Edmund has become a magician or because someone sensible has prevented him from attempting it." Eliza, who saw no honourable retreat, fell into step beside her. Edmund came with them, hands clasped behind his back in the manner of a man resigned to being discussed in his presence. The progress from hall to drawing-room became, in effect, an inspection. Lady Agnes asked after the linen, the still-room, the west stair, and whether Mrs. Biddle remained capable of feeding people without also despising them. "She despises them still," Eliza said, "but never to the detriment of dinner." Lady Agnes cast her a swift look of approval. "Excellent. A cook without opinions is usually a danger." When they reached the morning room, sunlight fell across a table newly covered in books and work-baskets. The curtains had been rehung. The chairs no longer stood in that melancholy arrangement, which suggests neglect and weak tea. Lady Agnes paused. "This room looks lived in," she said. "That is the idea," Edmund replied. "It was never the idea before." She moved to the mantel, adjusted by 1 inch a porcelain shepherdess, and glanced at Eliza. "You have had a hand in this." Eliza kept her tone even. "I have only been useful where I could." "Useful women," Lady Agnes said, "are very often the reason life continues at all, though they are not always thanked in proportion." The remark was lightly made, yet it landed with an accuracy Eliza felt in her chest. Lady Agnes went on before any answer was required. "You need not look so cautious, Miss Harcourt. I know competence when I see it. It is rarer than beauty and considerably more durable." Lucy, hovering at the doorway, looked instantly at Eliza with the expression of one who considered this the highest praise ever uttered by mortal lips. Lady Agnes glanced toward her. "And this must be your younger sister." "Lucy Harcourt," Eliza said. Lucy curtsied. "How do you do, ma'am?" Lady Agnes's gaze returned to Eliza. "Your sister agrees with me so violently that I begin to fear for her composure." Lucy coloured. "I am perfectly composed." "No one at your age ever is," said Lady Agnes kindly. "It would be a defect if you were." Tea was brought. Lady Agnes took 1 sip, approved it by continuing to drink it, and settled herself as if she intended to learn all that mattered before the hour was out. She asked Eliza about the village, Mr. Harcourt about the parish roofs when he arrived later, and Mrs. Wren, in passing, whether the silver inventory had at last been corrected. As the afternoon gave way to evening, she drew Edmund a little aside. "Well?" Edmund said under his breath. "Well," Lady Agnes returned, just as quietly. "The place has a pulse again." He looked relieved. "I am glad you think so. I did not say you had accomplished it alone." His expression became unreadable. Lady Agnes followed his glance and found Eliza across the room. "No," she said, "you did not." When she turned back toward Eliza, there was no impropriety in her look, no open hint, no smile that could be accused of meaning too much. Yet Eliza had the distinct and unsettling sense of having been measured, understood, and not found wanting. That evening, Halverton Hall put on one of those modest displays of elegance by which a country house reminds itself it was built for society and not solely for ledgers, leaking roofs, and disputes over lamp oil. Candles warmed the drawing room. A fire improved it. Dinner awaited beyond, with a ham glossy enough to inspire confidence and a trifle too decorative to be entirely trustworthy. It was not a grand party. Mr. and Mrs. Harcourt and Lucy formed the family circle. Lady Agnes had brought the Fenwicks with her, and Mrs. Dalrymple was expected later. All of it arranged with the confidence of a woman who never entered a room without supposing she improved it. Yet to Edmund, who had spent the previous weeks fighting disorder room by room, even a small gathering felt like a campaign. He was dressed accordingly. His coat sat to perfection, his shirt was immaculate, and his cravat was tied with such exactness that it gave no clue at all to the inward disorder he had carried since the greenhouse. That disorder had not improved. He had spent the day behaving like a rational landowner. He had met with the steward, reviewed accounts, answered letters, and endured a lengthy discussion with Mrs. Biddle concerning capers. Through all of it, his mind had returned with absurd regularity to Eliza's hand beneath his and the look in her eyes when she said she was glad she had found him there. By the time everyone was assembled, he had at least regained the appearance of composure. Sir Lionel Fenwick, with the easy grace of a man thoroughly satisfied with his own reflection in polished surfaces, was already making himself agreeable, while Lady Fenwick advanced beside him with the composed magnificence of a woman who had long ceased to require admiration because she fully expected it. "Halverton," Sir Lionel said, smiling as they shook hands. "One hears you have brought your house back from the edge of barbarism." "One hears too much in the county," Edmund replied. Sir Lionel laughed. "That is the county's chief recreation." "And exaggeration its chief talent," Lady Fenwick added, with a smile that made it impossible to tell whether she meant to flatter him or warn him. Lady Agnes, seated magnificently on a sofa of faded blue silk that looked improved by supporting her, received the room with dry authority, while Augustus, her small fawn-coloured pug, regarded the company like a minor nobleman prepared to be displeased. Mr. and Mrs. Harcourt were present. Lucy had been persuaded to sing later, and a neighbouring widow, Mrs. Dalrymple, had arrived in sea-green satin and with a lively interest in everyone's concerns. Then the door opened again. Eliza came into the room. For a moment, Edmund did not move at all. Eliza had not dressed to rival Lady Fenwick, nor could she have wished to. Where Lady Fenwick shone in silk and jewels, Eliza wore a gown of faded rose muslin, delicate in colour and entirely without ostentation. It was cut with grace rather than display, and candlelight found every quiet excellence in it. A small string of pearls rested at her throat. Her hair had been dressed more fully that evening, and the loose curl near her temple appeared not accidental but devastating. He had known she was beautiful. He had known it in mud at the cottages, in kitchen heat, in morning light, among rose pots. This was different. This was beauty placed before other eyes. Lady Agnes saw him see her. One of her brows moved. Eliza crossed the room with calm self-possession, though a slight colour had risen in her cheeks. She greeted Lady Agnes, spoke to Mrs. Dalrymple, smiled at Lucy, and turned at last to Edmund. "My lord." "Miss Harcourt." That was all. 2 ordinary words each. Yet the effort required to make them sound ordinary was enough to leave him briefly discontented with language itself. Lady Agnes said into the pause, "Edmund, do stop looking as though someone has altered the furniture in your absence. Offer Miss Harcourt a chair." Lucy bent her head so quickly over her reticule that Edmund suspected laughter. He recovered himself enough to say, "Miss Harcourt, will you sit here? The candles are kinder on this side of the room." Lady Agnes murmured, "They need not work so hard." Eliza heard that. So did Edmund. A warmer woman might have smiled openly at the havoc she caused. Eliza only cast Lady Agnes the briefest glance of reproof and took the offered seat. Conversation rose and settled around them. Mrs. Dalrymple asked after the village school. Mr. Harcourt spoke of an elderly parishioner who had fallen from a stool while hanging bacon. Sir Lionel recounted a minor incident from Bath, involving a card table and a colonel's daughter, though Lady Fenwick's expression suggested that in her version, neither the incident nor the daughter had been minor. Lucy, when pressed to the pianoforte, sang with enough sweetness to make everyone forgive a missed note. Through it all, Edmund remained aware of Eliza in the room with a clarity that was nearly absurd, of the turn of her wrist as she adjusted her glove, of the way the candlelight rested on the pearls at her throat, of her profile when she listened, of the fact that every person present now had the opportunity to admire what he had first valued in less adorned moments. When dinner was announced, the company moved into the next room. Sir Lionel secured a place beside Eliza with the smooth efficiency of a man who believed agreeable seating was one of the rights of civilization. Edmund, who had no grounds whatever to object and every instinct to do so, found himself at Lady Agnes's right hand, with Mrs. Dalrymple beyond him and an excellent view of Sir Lionel smiling over a plate of cold ham. Sir Lionel was not a fool. He gave Eliza the sort of polished attention that could pass anywhere for good breeding, though Edmund found it difficult in the extreme to be grateful for its propriety. "I have heard a great deal of your exertions at Halverton Hall, Miss Harcourt," he said, selecting a tart with fingers too elegant to be entirely trusted. "It is astonishing what energy may accomplish in a country house. One scarcely knows how the larger houses survive without such voluntary guardians." Eliza took a sip of wine before answering. "I believe most houses survive by paying their servants and mending their roofs in time." Lady Agnes lowered her eyes to her plate. Edmund knew that look. It was the expression she adopted when highly entertained and determined not to interrupt too soon. Sir Lionel smiled. "Delightful. Practical too. That is a rare combination." "I cannot think why," Eliza replied. "Can you not?" said Sir Lionel. "Because society insists too often upon one grace at the expense of the other." "Then society is wasteful," Eliza said. Mrs. Dalrymple gave a small cough, which concealed either shock or laughter. Mr. Harcourt became deeply occupied with mustard. Lady Agnes said, without looking up, "Take care, Sir Lionel. Miss Harcourt has a dangerous habit of answering." Sir Lionel laughed as if he had been praised. "You must own, Miss Harcourt, that your influence here has been singular." Eliza set down her fork. "Halverton Hall has many people working hard on its behalf, Sir Lionel. Influence is a large word for ordinary labour." "Modest too," he said. "You improve with acquaintance." That was the moment Edmund ceased to like him in any degree at all. Lady Agnes, still eating her dinner with tranquil appetite, said to Edmund in a voice pitched only for him, "Do not glower. It deepens the line between your brows." "I am not glowering." "You are. Very effectively." Across the table, Eliza was handling Sir Lionel with admirable steadiness. Edmund knew she required no rescue. That knowledge did not improve his temper. Sir Lionel lifted his glass. "And do you mean to continue these charitable campaigns, Miss Harcourt? Or shall the county lose its most industrious reformer when Halverton finds its feet again?" Eliza's face remained composed, but Edmund, who had lately learned to hear what lay beneath her words, caught the brief pause before she answered. "I have never regarded useful work as a campaign," she said, "only as something that must be done while it is needed." Sir Lionel inclined his head as if indulging a pretty seriousness. "A most female principle." Before Eliza could speak, Edmund did. "I should have thought," he said quietly, "that meeting responsibility directly was not particularly female or male, Sir Lionel, only uncommon enough to deserve respect wherever one finds it." Silence followed. Not long, not dramatic, yet definite. Sir Lionel looked at him and smiled, though the smile had altered by one shade. "Naturally, I spoke loosely." "That is often the trouble," Lady Agnes observed, reaching for another biscuit. "Loose speech wanders farther than people expect." Mrs. Dalrymple fixed her attention so firmly on the trifle that she might have been studying architecture. Eliza did not look at Edmund at once. She cut a piece of tart, set it down again, and then at last raised her eyes to his. The look lasted only a moment. It was enough. There was surprise in it, gratitude too. More dangerous by far was her growing awareness that his interruption had not sprung merely from courtesy. She had heard his tone. She knew, with a clarity that made her pulse quicken, that Sir Lionel's manner had displeased him personally. Lady Agnes knew it too. The ladies had scarcely reassembled in the drawing-room after dinner before Marmalade appeared at the door. He considered the company with his usual air of private judgment, then stopped and fixed Augustus with a stare of such open amazement that Lucy nearly laughed aloud. Augustus, seated beside Lady Agnes, returned the look with offended gravity, as if astonishment in others were a liberty he could not permit. The evening continued smoothly. Lucy was persuaded to sing again. Mr. Harcourt, in a muddle of papers and music, nearly sat on a book of sonatas. Mrs. Dalrymple recounted the marriage of a cousin to a naval captain who had brought home a monkey and 3 barrels of nutmeg. The evening recovered its surface ease, yet nothing was quite the same. Edmund stood near the mantel speaking to Sir Lionel with a courtesy that had become almost painfully exact. Eliza, seated by Lady Agnes, turned pages for Lucy at the pianoforte and answered questions with calm attention. Outwardly, all was smooth. Inwardly, she was conscious of Edmund in a way she had not been before, not only as the man from the greenhouse or the earnest Earl learning his estate, but as a man who minded when another treated her lightly. Lady Agnes, watching Lucy's music with an expression of false absorption, said very low, "My nephew has at last begun to resemble a human being." Eliza nearly dropped the page. "Lady Agnes!" "Hush," Lady Agnes murmured. "I am paying him a considerable compliment." "He was only being civil," Eliza said. Lady Agnes's eyes moved to Edmund and back again. "My dear Miss Harcourt, I have been acquainted with civil men all my life. They are everywhere." That was not the expression of mere civility. Heat rose into Eliza's cheeks. She bent over the music and said, because she could think of nothing wiser, "Lucy takes that passage too quickly." Without ceasing to play, Lucy murmured, "I am doing my best." "So is Edmund," said Lady Agnes, much more slowly. Lucy missed a note outright. Mrs. Harcourt beamed as though this were part of the entertainment. The evening ended without further disturbance. Cloaks were fetched, carriages called. The Fenwicks departed with every visible appearance of satisfaction, which Eliza found difficult to forgive. Mrs. Dalrymple drifted away in sea-green folds and excellent spirits. Lucy yawned prettily. Mr. Harcourt misplaced his gloves and discovered them in his hat. At the foot of the stairs, while Lady Agnes was issuing final instructions to her maid, and Mr. Pritchard was gliding through candlelight like a solemn crow, Edmund came toward Eliza. He stopped at a proper distance. "I hope," he said, composed again but not so composed as before, "that the evening did not fatigue you." "No," Eliza answered, "not greatly." His eyes held hers. "Sir Lionel can be careless." "Yes," she said. A faint line appeared between his brows. "I dislike carelessness in people who ought to know better." There was no safe reply to that, none that felt honest, so Eliza said only, "I observed as much." For one brief instant, a look passed between them so direct that the hall, the candles, the household, and the whole discipline of polite society seemed to blur at the edges. Then Lady Agnes called, "Edmund, if you mean to stand there saying meaningful nothings, do at least ring for fresh candles first. The hall grows dim." He shut his eyes for half a second, as if gathering what patience remained to him. Eliza could not help smiling. Lady Agnes, satisfied with the disorder she had caused, turned back to Mr. Pritchard as though she had done nothing at all. When Edmund opened his eyes and saw Eliza's smile, something softened in his face that no title, no evening clothes, and no careful composure could hide. The look remained with her long afterward. And later, when she had taken off her pearls, folded away her gloves, and let Lucy chatter herself nearly to sleep over all that had passed, Eliza lay awake beneath the quiet eaves of the vicarage, thinking not of Sir Lionel's smooth remarks, nor even of Lady Agnes's dangerous discernment. She thought of Edmund's voice when he said the word respect. For the first time, the danger seemed not merely that she might care for him too much. It was that he might soon care for her in a way the whole world could see. Chapter 7. Whispers. The shift began so slightly that at first, Eliza thought she had imagined it. Halverton Hall had settled into a brisker rhythm since Lady Agnes's arrival. The house seemed to stand a little straighter beneath her eye. Fires were lit at the proper hour. Trays arrived more promptly. Footmen moved with renewed purpose. Even the faded blue saloon, long resigned to neglect, had recovered enough dignity to suggest that almost any room might revive if given clean curtains and stricter expectations. Yet a household, however improved, was still made of people. And people, Eliza knew, could no more be polished into silence than silver could be polished into virtue. The first moment came in the upper passage near the linen room. Eliza had gone there with Mrs. Wren to discuss table napery for the larger gathering expected the following week. The passage smelled faintly of lavender, beeswax, and sun-warmed wood. A maid carrying folded sheets came hurrying round the corner with another behind her, both speaking in quick, breathless voices. The instant they saw Eliza, they stopped. It was not a dramatic silence. It was worse. One girl coloured and lowered her eyes. The other altered her hold on the sheets and said, much too brightly, "Beg pardon, miss," as if no conversation at all had been underway. Mrs. Wren, who missed very little, looked from them to Eliza and back again. "Mind those sheets, Mary," she said mildly. "They will not improve for being dropped." "Yes, ma'am." The girls disappeared. Eliza stood still a moment longer than was necessary. Mrs. Wren shut the linen room door with measured care. Young women often discover silence more quickly than sense. Eliza managed a faint smile. Then perhaps they are merely efficient. Perhaps, Mrs. Wren's composed eyes rested on her face. And perhaps they have heard their elders speak too freely. The words were kindly meant, which made them no easier to hear. Eliza bent over the stack of napkins on the table. "I dare say a house of this size always provides matter for talk." "That is true," Mrs. Wren replied, "but not always anything worth repeating." It was kindly said, and no comfort at all. Afterward, in the course of the morning, Eliza noticed other things. Each was slight enough to dismiss. Taken together, they formed a pattern too clear to ignore. A housemaid in the back passage bobbed a curtsy and then looked away with sudden, bright curiosity, poorly hidden. A visiting neighbour, Mrs. Trench, smiled over her teacup and said, "My dear Miss Harcourt, I scarcely know whether to call at the vicarage now or at Halverton Hall to see you. One hears you have become nearly indispensable there." The words were harmless enough upon the surface. The tone beneath them was not. Eliza answered, "Then pray continue at the vicarage, ma'am. I would not wish to confuse your habits." Mrs. Trench laughed exactly as such women always laughed when they had tested the air and found resistance beneath the lace. Later, as Eliza crossed the village green with a basket on her arm, she heard two gentlemen standing near the inn window speaking in lowered voices. A very useful young woman. Yes, but usefulness in a great house is never merely usefulness. Whatever followed was cut short when one of them turned and saw her. Both removed their hats. Both bowed. Neither looked embarrassed enough. It was then that she knew, not fully, not in the gross and open way of public insult, but enough. Enough to feel comfort peel away. Enough to understand that admiration had begun to alter into something colder. When a woman was praised for being capable, she was safe only so long as she seemed to claim nothing for herself. Let her be needed too much, seen too often, matter too visibly in a house above her own standing, and usefulness became ambition in other people's mouths. Nearness became calculation, respect became a tale told with lifted brows. Eliza knew this before anyone said it plainly, because she had lived as a clergyman's daughter all her life. People did not need facts, they needed only repetition and leisure. That afternoon, Lucy found her in the sitting room at the vicarage, sorting old account books for waste paper. Lucy sat on the edge of the table. Something is wrong. Nothing is wrong, Eliza said. Lucy frowned. That is not true. You said it in your I am perfectly well voice. Eliza continued stacking papers. I did not know I possessed one. You do. It means you are either offended, anxious, or trying not to cry. Which is it? Eliza let out a breath that might almost have been laughter. Lucy, you are the least discreet creature alive. Lucy lifted her chin. And therefore the most useful when anyone is unhappy. The affectionate nonsense of it nearly undid her. She sat down at last, one hand still resting on the papers. People have begun to talk. Lucy's expression changed at once. Who? Everyone and no one. The most efficient kind of people. Lucy slid from the table and came nearer. Because of Halverton? Yes. Because of his lordship? Eliza did not answer. Lucy's face clouded with anger. How fortunate for them. They are so seldom equal to any harder work. Despite herself, Eliza smiled faintly. It is hateful, Lucy said. It is ordinary, Eliza answered. Which is worse? Lucy knelt beside her chair and took her hand. You have done nothing wrong. I know, Eliza said, but that does not stop people talking. She tried then to reason with herself. She told herself she had always known such danger might come. She told herself Halverton Hall mattered more than her own comfort. She told herself, too, that Edmund had done nothing to invite censure except value her company too visibly in rooms where others were looking. That thought ought to have steadied her. Instead, it made her heart ache with a weakness she despised in herself. For it was not the gossip alone that wounded. It was the knowledge that something precious had become visible enough to be injured. Later, as she crossed the hall with a list of household supplies in hand, Lady Agnes glanced up from a letter and regarded her for one brief, penetrating moment. The county has begun entertaining itself, I see, she said. Eliza stopped. I had not realized it was in want of occupation. It always is, said Lady Agnes. That is half the business of gentility. There was no comfort in the remark, but there was understanding in it, and Eliza found that almost worse. By evening, the air had turned close and heavy, and the house seemed to listen. A summer storm threatened beyond the windows but did not yet break. The sky over the west lawn held a strange, pale brightness edged with slate. Indoors, candles had been lit early. Their flames stood very still. In the corridor outside the morning room, footsteps and distant voices carried more clearly than usual. Eliza had gone there to leave with Edmund a revised set of arrangements for the house party. Mrs. Merriweather's early arrival had unsettled the room assignments. 2 additional servants would be needed for the second evening, and the wine merchant in York had written with bad news about the claret. These were matters that required decisions, matters that, unlike the state of her own heart, still yielded to order. She found him alone by the window, reading a letter with one hand braced against the writing table. He looked up at once. That alone still had the power to affect her. The immediacy of his attention, as though in any room he could always tell the difference between her step and another's. Miss Harcourt, he said, I was about to send for you. The words stirred a faint unease she could not yet name. I have brought the amended list for the house party, she said, placing the folded paper on the table between them. Mrs. Biddle has yielded on the question of capers but not on the quantity of sugar. That seems almost generous of her, he remarked. Only because she means to demand something worse tomorrow, she said. He smiled briefly, but the smile did not settle. Outside, thunder muttered somewhere beyond the trees. Edmund looked down at the list, then set it aside without opening it. I wish to speak with you on another matter. A colder sensation passed through her. Yes? He seemed to choose his words with care, and because she knew him now, the care itself alarmed her. I have become aware, he said, that some people in the house, and perhaps beyond it, have begun to speculate more freely than they should. Eliza stood very still. He went on at once, perhaps mistaking stillness for permission. I dislike that you should be exposed to any unkindness on my account. It was never my intention that your kindness to this household should place you in an uncomfortable position. Her fingers tightened around her gloves. No, she said. I do not suppose it was. He heard something in her voice then and took a step nearer. Miss Harcourt, I mean only that people are foolish. They attach significance where none ought to be attached, and speak carelessly when a woman's reputation may be affected by it. There it was. Not cruelty, only caution, offered as protection, and somehow managing to wound just the same. Eliza's throat felt suddenly dry. And what, she asked with remarkable steadiness, do you propose should be done? He hesitated, only a moment. I thought, he said, that perhaps it would be wiser if, for a little while, we were less often seen together except where necessity plainly requires it. For one suspended instant, the room seemed to empty of sound. Then Eliza said, very quietly, I see. He drew breath, as if relief might still be possible. It need not alter anything essential. Her gaze lifted to his. No? You ask that we meet less often, speak less openly, and appear less connected. You call it prudence. The world will call it correction. His face changed. That is not what I intend. It is what it will look like. Only to malicious people. Those are precisely the people who govern such matters. Outside, the storm broke at last. Rain struck the panes in a sudden rush. Edmund's voice dropped. I would never willingly shame you. No, Eliza answered. Only hide me. The words landed. She saw them land. For a moment she thought he might deny it. Then perhaps that he might cross the room, forget prudence for once, and say something plain enough to mend what had been torn. He did neither. When he spoke again, his voice had gone colder from effort, not feeling. If that is truly your opinion of me, I do not know how to defend myself against it. The restraint of that sentence hurt more than anger might have done. Eliza folded her gloves once, then again, because her hands needed occupation if they were not to tremble. And if people conclude from your new caution, she said, that I have indeed overstepped, will that improve matters, or only prove that I was worth receiving while useful, and worth concealing once observed? A muscle moved in his jaw. That is unjust, Edmund said. Eliza met his gaze. Is it? Yes. The word came sharp enough to show the strain beneath it. Because you know very well that I think more highly of you than... He broke off. The unfinished sentence hung between them like something too dangerous to touch. Eliza's heart gave one hard, painful beat. Then what? She asked. He looked at her as if he had come suddenly to the edge of something and knew it. Then I ought to say now, he answered. That was worse. Worse because it was true. Worse because he felt it too. Worse because he would still choose caution over her. She lifted her chin. There is no need, she said. You have been candid. I am grateful to understand my position. His face altered at that, but she would not let herself look too closely. Miss Harcourt, no. She spoke gently, almost kindly, which made it worse for them both. You are right in one respect, my lord. People do speak carelessly. It would be foolish to provide them further entertainment. His expression altered, and the colour drained from his face. She curtsied. Not deeply, only correctly. Then she moved toward the door. He said her name once. Eliza. He had never spoken it before except under cover of urgency. Hearing it now, in that low, shaken voice, nearly stopped her where she was. Nearly. She kept her hand on the door latch and did not turn fully back. Yes, my lord. It cost him something visible to answer in the old formality. I never meant to hurt you. At that, she did look at him. He stood by the table in the half-lit room, one candle burning low at his side. The rain behind him turning the window black and silver. His face was drawn with the effort of restraint. His eyes, usually so controlled, showed enough feeling now to make everything more dangerous, not less. Eliza had to press her lips together before she trusted them. I know, she said. And because that was true, because he had hurt her out of care rather than indifference, because the whole sorrow of it lay exactly there. Her voice softened despite herself. She looked at him then. That is why it matters. She went out before he could answer. The corridor beyond was empty. Candlelight stretched in dim pools along the panelling. From downstairs came the muffled clatter of supper trays and the rise and fall of servants' voices near the back stairs. Eliza walked the length of the corridor, with her head high and her steps perfectly even. Not until Eliza had reached the little room where she kept household notes and patterns did she allow herself to sit. She set her gloves on the table with great care. Then she looked at nothing at all. She had not cried. She would not cry. She was too angry for tears and too wounded for comfort. Yet beneath the anger, beneath the humiliation and the ache, there remained the most miserable truth of all. She believed him. She believed he had wished to spare her. She believed, too, that he had failed to understand what a woman heard when a man asked her to disappear from view. In the morning room, Edmund remained where she had left him. The rain beat hard against the glass. The list for the house party still lay unopened on the table. After some moments he picked it up, unfolded it, and stared at the neat practical hand in which rice, nutmeg, cherries and lamp oil were set down as if the world could yet be governed by order. His jaw tightened. He had gone into the conversation determined to protect her. He had come out of it having struck, with miserable precision, at the very thing he least wished to injure. And because he was honest, he could not wholly comfort himself by thinking her unfair. Some part of him knew too late that she had heard not caution but retreat, not care but distance, not shield but shame. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, the room looked altered, though nothing in it had changed at all. The chair beside which she had stood remained where it was. The candle still burned. Rain ran down the window in silver lines. Yet the place felt emptied of something essential, as if warmth had gone out of it and left only arrangement behind. That night Halverton Hall was all propriety, and for the first time since Eliza Harcourt had begun to move through its rooms as though she belonged to their work and pulse, it seemed to Edmund not improved, but unbearably cold. Chapter 8. Under one roof. The next days at Halverton Hall passed in full occupation and marked restraint. Nothing openly dramatic occurred. No door was shut in anger. No voice rose in the corridor. No servant, had any servant been asked, could have pointed to a single scene and said, "There, that was the moment all ease departed." Yet ease had departed. It showed itself in small omissions, in altered habits, in the quiet way that two people who had once moved naturally toward one another now kept, with unfailing civility, one careful step apart. Eliza came to the house each morning as she had before. She was always punctual. She wore practical gowns, still graceful but quieter now in colour than those of earlier weeks. Dove-grey muslin, soft brown with plain ribbon, pale olive that brought a cool light to her complexion and made Lucy declare it unfair that sadness should improve anyone. Her gloves were neatly mended. Her bonnet strings were always properly tied. Nothing in her appearance suggested disorder. Only a person who knew her well would have seen that she smiled less readily, and never now because she had forgotten herself. Edmund, for his part, seemed to have withdrawn into a darker exactness. His coats were of the severest country shades, his shirt immaculate, his whole person arranged with such control that he looked, Eliza thought once with inward bitterness, like a man determined to be unassailable by his own feelings. Their work continued. A ledger was brought into the morning room by a footman and laid between them on the table. Edmund indicated a column without letting his hand rest too near hers. Eliza leaned to inspect the figures, then sat back again before any accidental nearness could occur. "The coal estimate for the East Wing is too high," she said. "Yes," Edmund answered. "I thought so as well." That was all. On another morning, Mrs. Wren entered with a list of bedroom arrangements for the expected guests. Eliza suggested changing 2 rooms on the upper floor. Edmund agreed. Their voices were level. Their eyes scarcely met. Messages passed between them through servants, when once they would have spoken directly. Dessert plates were counted, guest towels aired, bedroom fires considered. No one could have objected to the arrangement. It was efficient. It was sensible. It was also intolerable. Even meals had altered. On the days when Lady Agnes persuaded Eliza to remain for a tray in the small sitting room, Edmund spoke with courtesy and attention to everyone present. He inquired after Lucy's headache. He asked Mrs. Merriweather whether her rooms were comfortable. He listened to Lady Agnes's opinions on a neighbouring family's marriage settlements with the grave endurance of a man weathering artillery. But when Eliza spoke of household matters, he answered with formal precision, as though each sentence had first been inspected for danger. "The lamp oil arrived, my lord." "I am glad of it, Miss Harcourt." "Mrs. Biddle wishes to know whether the salmon, if it arrives, should be served hot on Friday, or reserved for the dinner itself. Whichever she judges freshest will answer best." Nothing in such exchanges could be faulted. That was the misery of it. Lady Agnes, who missed nothing and had little patience with foolishness, watched these arrangements as though observing 2 intelligent people make a very stupid mistake. On the 3rd afternoon after the quarrel, she said to Eliza, while apparently occupied with trimming a frayed ribbon from one of Lucy's reticules, "This new style of conversation is very refined." Eliza, seated at the work table with a list of pantry supplies, did not look up. "I am glad it meets with approval." "It does not. It is dreary." Lucy, at the window with a book open and unread in her lap, said in a small voice, "I thought so too, but I did not wish to be unkind." Lady Agnes snipped the ribbon cleanly. "My dear child, when conversation grows this lifeless, honesty is the kinder choice." Eliza bent lower over the list. "There is a great deal to do." "Undoubtedly," said Lady Agnes. "That is no reason to behave like strangers." That remark stayed with Eliza long after the conversation ended. The distance between her and Edmund had become tangible in the house. She felt it in the way he no longer took anything directly from her hand if it could first be laid down between them. She felt it when some practical absurdity occurred, and she turned to make a dry remark, only to remember in time that such ease no longer belonged to them. She felt it in the silence after his footsteps passed her in the corridor. The worst of it was that she understood the effort beneath the formality. He was still trying to do what he believed was right, and because she knew that, anger could not remain simple. As if the emotional discomfort of the household were not sufficient employment, the practical world chose that week to become unruly. On Tuesday morning, the expected letter arrived from the wine merchant in York, confirming, with every appearance of distress and no useful remedy, that only half the claret ordered for the house party could be sent before Monday. On Wednesday, a second letter came from Lady Agnes's old friend, Mrs. Bellamy, to say that she meant to arrive a day earlier than expected, bringing with her an unmarried niece, 2 spaniels, and opinions on all domestic arrangements. By Thursday, the sky had become so uncertain that any notion of receiving guests in the garden at any point during the visit had to be treated as romance rather than plan. Clouds gathered every afternoon and discharged themselves in either nothing at all or a downpour sufficient to turn the lower lawn into a warning. So many guests arriving early was bound to have repercussions. Mrs. Biddle, when informed that the altered guest numbers might require some adjustment to the supper menu, refused at once and with force. "I will not have my pastries spoiled by panic," she declared, one floury hand on her hip and the other brandishing a wooden spoon. "If ladies choose to multiply unexpectedly, that is no reason to ruin a tart." Eliza, who had entered the kitchen at the height of this speech, was not in the least surprised. "No one proposes ruining a tart, Mrs. Biddle." "That is because no one here but me knows the danger." "The danger," Eliza said, "is that if the table looks meagre, Lady Agnes will observe it at once." Mrs. Biddle narrowed her eyes. "That is unfair." "It is also true," Eliza said. Mrs. Biddle sniffed. "That is what makes it offensive." From the doorway, Lucy said, The greater danger is that the spaniels will get into the cold ham. Mrs. Biddle looked at her with deep suspicion. Miss Lucy, I have seen what dogs can do to a supper table, and I do not mean to see it again. Lucy blinked. That seems severe. Mrs. Biddle grunted. I speak from experience. Even in distress, Eliza nearly smiled. The kitchen smelled of warm bread, onions frying in butter, and chopped herbs. Copper pans shone over the fire. Trays of pastry waited beneath cloths. A ham for the smaller supper had been glazed and set aside. Near the window stood cream jugs, loaves, a pie cooling under a net, and a row of jars catching the light like little hoards of amber and ruby. These things still needed managing. The world did not pause because a heart had become uncomfortable. So Eliza went on. She sent a note to the vicarage, asking Lucy to count the best dessert spoons. She met Edmund in the steward's room to review room assignments after Mrs. Merriweather and Bellamy's premature assault on the calendar. The blue chamber must go to the niece, Eliza said, examining the list. Not the yellow. The yellow room's chimney smokes in damp weather. Edmund nodded. The niece may then be given the smaller dressing room beside it. Yes. A pause. He added. Will that be sufficient? It must be. Another pause. I shall have the housemaid warned about the dogs, he said. Thank you. That was the entire conversation. Yet Eliza came away from it with the old ache freshened, because once such matters had flown between them with thought, wit, and mutual confidence. Now each practical answer sounded like a note struck on a piano with the pedal lifted. Clear enough, and without warmth. By the end of the week she had begun, quietly and without speaking of it to anyone, to prepare herself inwardly for departure. She did not mean to leave before the house party. That would have been cowardly and unfair to everyone in the house, except perhaps herself. Halverton Hall still required finishing touches too numerous and too exact to be abandoned in a fit of wounded pride. The linen cupboards must be checked once more. The best guest towels had yet to be aired. Mrs. Wren needed a final answer on the flowers for the principal rooms. Mrs. Biddle still held, in reserve, several arguments about almonds. No. Eliza would stay. She would do every part of what she had undertaken. But afterward, the work would be complete. The house would either stand well enough before the county, or it would not. Edmund would no longer need the daily guidance he had once admitted, however reluctantly, that he lacked. Lady Agnes would remain some days longer and could steady what social currents needed it. The servants had recovered confidence. Systems had been put in place. The estate itself was beginning, in visible ways, to answer to firmer management. There would be no reason for Eliza Harcourt to continue appearing at Halverton Hall with such frequency. That thought, once settled, behaved not like relief but like grief. She did not indulge it. She folded it instead into her mind the way one folds a letter not to be opened until one has no choice. Only once did Lucy force the matter. They were walking back from the village in the late afternoon, their skirts brushing the long grass at the edge of the lane, when Lucy said abruptly, "You mean to leave after the party?" Eliza turned to look at her. "Who told you so?" "No one," Lucy replied, "but you have the expression of a woman packing invisible trunks." Despite herself, Eliza gave a faint laugh. "That is a shocking image." "It is a correct one." Eliza looked ahead to where Halverton Hall stood beyond the trees, pale and handsome in the thickening light. For a moment its windows flashed where the clouds broke. "Yes," she said at last, "I think I must." Lucy was silent for several steps. Then she asked, very softly, "Will he let you?" The tenderness in the question almost undid her. "He has no right to prevent me," Eliza said. Lucy made no answer. They both knew that rights were not the subject. Instead, she tucked her arm more firmly through Eliza's and said, with an effort at brightness, "Then I shall be obliged to become very tiresome and follow you everywhere, because I cannot support a life in which I am the only untidy sister." Eliza glanced at her. "You are not untidy. You are merely decorative in your methods." Lucy gave her an injured look. That is a cruel distinction. It is an accurate one. Lucy sighed. I am glad one of us remains capable of accuracy. That night the rain came again. It had rained the day before and threatened all morning to continue the habit. By evening the house was wrapped in that muffled, enclosed feeling rain gives to large country places, as though the outer world had withdrawn and left only lamplight, corridors, and whatever discomfort one had failed to settle before dusk. Edmund had been in the library since dinner, attempting to review the revised list of household expenses before the house party. The lamp burned steadily. Rain traced shifting lines down the long windows. The shelves, dark with old leather bindings, gave the room its usual air of authority. But tonight authority felt like a hollow comfort. He had read the same column of figures 3 times. Coal, candles, sugar, musicians, fish, and carriage repairs. None of it held. At last, he set down the paper and leaned back in the chair, one hand over his eyes. He missed her. The truth, once permitted, went through him with humiliating ease. Not only her conversation, though he missed that keenly. Not only her wit, the dry lift of it in a difficult moment, or the practical intelligence with which she seemed to enter confusion and discover at once where the true problem lay. It was that the whole texture of his days had changed when she entered them. Without Eliza, Halverton Hall might have been a disaster. It was a large, handsome confusion full of duties demanding mastery, and he had come to it with too little knowledge and too much to answer for. She had not made it easier exactly. She had often made it more difficult by insisting he see what he would rather have settled quickly. But she had made it living. She had connected room to room, servant to master, account to kitchen, hedge to human consequence. Through her, the house had acquired pulse, and through her, though he had not known it until too late, his own days had acquired pleasure. He thought of ridiculous things. The first time she had looked at him in frank disbelief over a shelf of candied peel. Rain darkening the curls near her temples in the carriage after the cottage visits. Her laughter in the dining room after the rescued dinner when the candles burned low and Victory smelled of roast fowl and melted wax. The greenhouse, her hand beneath his around the terracotta pot. The stillness after, the look in her face when she had said she was glad she had found him there. He rose abruptly and crossed to the window. Outside the lawn gleamed wet and silver grey. The yews stood black beyond it. One upper window in the east range still showed light, perhaps in Mrs. Wren's room or one of the maids' attics. The rest of the house seemed orderly, prosperous in prospect, nearly ready to receive the world. Yet all that order had become intolerably thin. He had thought, in speaking to Eliza as he had, to shield her by discipline. He saw now that discipline without courage had only chilled everything it touched. Worse still, he had asked her, not in words so crude, but in effect, to bear the cost of his concern by making herself smaller in the very places where she had enlarged life for everyone around him. The shame of that bit deep. He understood then why her final words had pursued him ever since. That is why it matters. Because she had known he did not mean to wound her. Because intention did not prevent it. Because a woman who has spent her life being useful can hear, in a man's caution, the old verdict that she may serve but must not remain too visible. He set one hand against the cold glass. It was a strange thing, and not at all agreeable, for a man who had always preferred clarity to discover that his deepest truth had grown plain only when he had made a muddle of everything. There was only one truth left to him. He loved her. Not in some passing way that might be reasoned into silence, not with admiration only, though he admired her with all the steadiness of his nature. Not merely with gratitude, dependence, or desire, though all of those lived in it too. He loved the soundness of her mind, the force of her judgment, the warmth she gave where she trusted, the courage with which she saw what must be faced, the very sharpness that had first offended and then delighted him. He loved that she could stand in a kitchen and restore a dinner, in a cottage and restore a plan, in a house and restore its centre. He loved that she made him wish to be more open, more just, less proud of competence purchased at a distance. And most ruinously of all, The knowledge that he had hurt her would not let him rest. Because a man may admire many things, he may desire many things. But when another person's pain enters his heart as if it belongs there and refuses to be dismissed, he is already lost past all management. The library door opened softly. Lady Agnes came in without ceremony, carrying a candle and a look that suggested she had not the smallest intention of pretending not to know the nature of his thoughts. "You are not reading," she observed. "No." "Good. You were doing it very badly." He almost laughed, which felt like a betrayal of misery, but happened anyway. "Do you ever enter a room without seeing directly through the nearest person?" "Rarely. It would waste time." She set the candle on the table and came to stand beside him at the window. For a moment, they both looked out at the rain. Then she said, in a quieter tone, "You have managed the house admirably in one respect, Edmund. It now looks exactly like a place where a fool might lose his happiness through caution." He did not answer. Lady Agnes glanced at him. "Well, I have been a fool." "Yes," she said, "but not, I think, an irredeemable one." He drew a slow breath. "I wished to protect her." Lady Agnes looked at him. "And did she seem protected?" "No." "Then perhaps you chose the wrong weapon." He turned from the window. "I do not know how to mend it." "That is unfortunate," Lady Agnes replied, "because I suspect you must." The room fell quiet again. At last, Edmund said, with the stark simplicity of a man too tired for disguise, "I cannot bear the thought of her leaving when this is done." Lady Agnes's expression altered. Some severity left it. "My dear boy," she said, "that sounds very like love." He looked at her. "Yes," he answered, "it does." The admission, once spoken aloud, did not relieve him. It only made the silence after it more truthful. Yet as he stood in the lamplit library, with the rain beyond and the house around him nearly restored, he understood something he should perhaps have learned much sooner. A house might be set in order by lists, labour, and resolve. A heart, once disordered by love, required courage. And courage, unlike lamp oil or claret, could not be sent for from York. Chapter 9. Not a Trifle. The day of the house party began in motion before the sun had properly claimed the sky. As the afternoon declined, the service passages of Halverton Hall filled with trays, folded linen, warming pans, and messages exchanged at speed. Fires had been built up in every useful grate in readiness for the evening. The kitchen glowed with labour. Salmon, obtained at the cost of 3 hastily sent notes, 1 argument, and an alarming sum, had arrived fresh enough to satisfy even Mrs. Biddle after inspection by eye, hand, and judgment. Upstairs, chambermaids hurried through the guest rooms with fresh water, aired towels, and newly turned sheets, while Mrs. Wren moved from room to room like calm itself, correcting a curtain here, replacing a cracked jug there, and seeming to know by instinct which chamber required a stronger fire, which a different pillow, and where a lamp should be placed before the first carriage came up the drive. Through all of it, Eliza's hand could be felt. She had chosen the flowers in the entrance hall, prevented an over-ambitious jelly from disgracing the supper table, and persuaded Mrs. Wren that the Blue Saloon should be opened before dinner, because the light there at dusk made even ordinary conversation seem distinguished. By afternoon, she had done so much and spoken so little of herself that she felt, as she often did in moments of greatest exertion, almost invisible. That sensation did not improve her temper. At the vicarage, later than she wished and earlier than Lucy thought possible, she dressed for the evening. Lucy insisted on helping, and was, for once, more useful than ornamental. The gown Eliza wore had been Lady Agnes's doing. No daughter of a country vicar would have chosen deep blue silk for herself without reckoning the cost, but Lady Agnes had sent it over that afternoon as if beauty and budget were matters never meant to be acquainted. It was darker than any shade Eliza wore by day, rich enough to turn almost grey where candlelight touched its folds. Pearls rested at her throat and ears, simple enough not to look borrowed from another life, lovely enough to feel for one night wholly her own. When she stood at last before the little glass above the dressing table, Lucy clasped her hands. If he does not lose all command of himself, I shall think less of noblemen forever. Lucy. Well, Lucy said, without the least shame. Blindness should have consequences. Eliza could not properly laugh, but she smiled, which was something. At Halverton Hall, the first carriages arrived just after dusk. Wheels rolled over wet gravel, lamps gleamed, footmen ran down the steps with cloaks and arms extended. The house looked well. Better than well, it looked settled into itself again. Lady Agnes received the first arrivals with majestic assurance. Mrs. Bellamy, who had arrived a day early, appeared in plum satin and with a look that suggested she expected both comfort and conversation to be provided in equal measure. Her husband, Mr. Bellamy, who had only lately recovered from the gout, followed with careful dignity and the air of a man who considered his attendance itself a contribution to the evening. Her niece, Miss Anne Langley, was young enough to admire everything sincerely. Mrs. Merriweather, who had come early and meant to miss nothing, received each new arrival with the composed excitement of a woman determined to be equal to every event. Mrs. Dalrymple arrived later in primrose silk, and with an excellent appetite for social observation. Sir Wilfrid Vane came with his widowed sister, Mrs. Greer, who had soft manners, excellent jewels, and a way of missing nothing. Mr. Frederick Hale, a gentleman of agreeable fortune and still more agreeable self-opinion, followed soon after, prepared to be pleased wherever he was properly attended to. The Fenwicks were expected only for dinner. The Reverend Mr. Ashton and his sister, Miss Ashton, completed the early party. He benevolent and absent-minded, she brisk enough to remember on his behalf whatever he forgot. Mrs. Bellamy's 2 spaniels, after an early attempt upon the flower arrangements, were removed upstairs under protest. Edmund stood near the drawing-room hearth and welcomed them all with outward composure. He had been glad, more glad than he had any business to be, that Lady Agnes had insisted Miss Harcourt be included among the party. None of that composure survived Eliza's entrance. She wore blue, deep, quiet blue, made more vivid by candlelight and the brightness of her skin. Pearls lay against her throat. Her hair had been dressed with greater softness than usual, and the effect was not elaborate, only ruinously becoming. He had known she was beautiful. He had known it in morning light, in kitchens, in gardens, in rain. This was different. To see her thus, beneath the candles and before company, was to discover that admiration in private had been the lesser trial. This demanded not tenderness but self-command, and for one treacherous instant he possessed none. He forgot entirely what Lady Agnes had once called the obligations of breathing. Lady Agnes, watching from the sofa, said dryly, "Edmund, you may continue staring if you like, but do not expect the rest of us to assist." He recovered himself by effort. Eliza crossed the room with grave composure and acknowledged him with the sort of cold precision that made courtesy feel very nearly like reproof. "My lord." Miss Harcourt. Those 2 words, after all that had passed between them and all that had not, seemed grotesquely insufficient. Lady Agnes added, "Excellent. We have established that neither of you is mute. Society may yet survive the evening." Lucy lowered her head at once, plainly to hide laughter. She had accompanied Eliza and remained, by Lady Agnes's express permission, among the younger part of the company, quiet in manner, though her eyes missed very little. Dinner was announced. The meal began well. Silver gleamed. Candles held steady. The salmon was pronounced excellent by those whose approval mattered, and by many whose approval did not. Mrs. Biddle's soups and sauces passed without incident, which in a house party was nearly equivalent to triumph. The footman dropped nothing. Mr. Pritchard moved about the room like solemn success. The real glory of the evening, however, was the trifle. It arrived in a deep glass bowl, layered with custard, syllabub, sponge, candied peel, and so many cherries that Miss Anne Langley looked at it as though it were a work of art. Even Mrs. Dalrymple, who was not generous with praise, declared it beautiful before tasting it, and admirable afterward. Mr. Bellamy, who had only just recovered from the gout, took 1 helping, and then, after only the briefest pause, a second. Mrs. Bellamy gave him a look that made her opinion perfectly plain. Even Sir Wilfrid, observing from 3 places off, appeared grateful to be merely a spectator. Mr. Bellamy, however, continued eating. By the time the ladies withdrew to the Blue Saloon, Eliza had begun to think the evening might pass without catastrophe. It was, she reflected afterward, an optimistic thought. Coffee had just been served. Mrs. Dalrymple was admiring the arrangement of roses on the mantel. Miss Langley was saying with perfect earnestness how very pretty she thought the curtains. Lady Agnes had only just settled herself when a blur of orange shot through the half-open door. "Marmalade!" Eliza shouted. Marmalade did not pause. He streaked beneath a chair, across the hearthrug, and under a side table with the velocity of a creature fully aware of having made a poor decision too late to correct it. In the next instant, the 2 visiting spaniels burst into the room after him, ears flying and claws skidding on the polished floor. A beat behind them came Augustus, who until that moment had seemed above such folly and had evidently decided that age was no reason to miss a pursuit. Miss Langley gave a small cry. Mrs. Merriweather lifted her skirts. Mrs. Dalrymple laughed outright. Lady Agnes merely raised her feet. "Well," she said, "the room is alive." "Lucy," Eliza said, already moving. "The biscuits!" Lucy snatched up the plate from the coffee tray at once. "Do not chase them," Eliza added to a footman who had taken one eager step forward. "Open the terrace door instead." The door was opened, and cool evening air entered with it. Mrs. Bellamy required smelling salts, Miss Langley required reassurance, the spaniels required restraint, and the cat required nothing whatsoever. Lady Agnes surveyed them all with composed disbelief. "Bring the salts for Mrs. Bellamy," she said, "and a saucer for the cat. One likes at least one member of the company to preserve its self-possession." Marmalade, finding himself momentarily unpursued, sprang to the top of a low cabinet, and there arched his back with the expression of a creature personally betrayed by civilization. One of the spaniels halted beneath him in ecstatic agitation. The other, tempted by the biscuits in Lucy's hand, abandoned principle for food. Augustus, seeing the biscuits too, reconsidered the moral value of pursuit and changed sides. Within half a minute, the crisis had passed. The spaniels were removed. Augustus was carried away, his blue ribbon slightly askew, looking mildly astonished by the whole business. Marmalade remained on the cabinet, offended beyond consolation. Lady Fenwick put a hand to her bosom. "How fortunate that it ended so quickly." "Everything does," said Lady Agnes, accepting her coffee again, "if one gives the right orders to the right people." When the gentlemen joined them later, the room had regained its composure. Cards were proposed. Music was requested. Conversation divided into those tributaries of wit, vanity, boredom, flirtation and observation by which an English country house persuades itself it is socially alive. Edmund, entering behind Sir Lionel Fenwick, saw at once that the evening was holding. That fact seemed to sharpen rather than soften Sir Lionel's interest. He came at last to the group near the tall windows with a glass in his hand and a smile polished to the last degree. "One can scarcely believe," he said, glancing about the room, "that this is the same Halverton Hall one encountered a month ago. The transformation has been quite the entertainment of the season." Miss Langley, too young to hear danger beneath smoothness, said eagerly, "It is all very beautiful." "Yes," Sir Lionel replied, "a remarkable improvement. Though of course it does show what may be achieved when talent is allowed rather free scope." Eliza felt, rather than saw, Edmund, at the other end of the room, turn his head. Lady Agnes's fan paused. Sir Lionel went on, smiling at Eliza, as though inviting her into a harmless amusement. "One hopes the county will not draw the wrong lesson from so happy a transformation. If every capable young lady begins reorganizing gentlemen's houses, society will have no idea where to seat itself." Mrs. Merriweather laughed uncertainly. Eliza's cheeks remained cool. "Then society must learn to keep its accounts better," Eliza said. A small sound escaped Lady Agnes that might have been approval. Sir Lionel bowed. "Delightful. But I think we all understand there are limits." Assistance is admirable in its place. One would merely regret seeing zeal mistaken for position. The words were soft. They were smiling. They were meant to diminish under the appearance of elegance. For one suspended instant, the room seemed to wait. Eliza stood very still. She could have answered. She could have cut him neatly enough to amuse half the company and offend the other half. And yet it was not defense she wanted in that moment. It was justice. She did not know she had looked toward Edmund until she found him already moving. He crossed the room with no haste and no uncertainty. That calmness was more arresting than anger would have been. Conversation thinned as he approached. Not because he raised his voice or altered his expression beyond decorum, but because command in him was most visible when held tightly. He stopped beside Eliza. The position itself said too much for some, and exactly enough for others. "I think," he said, addressing Sir Lionel with perfect clarity, "that limits are most often mentioned by those who have never been of much use themselves." Silence fell. Sir Lionel's colour altered by one shade. "My dear Halverton, I was speaking only in admiration of Miss Harcourt's energy." "No," Edmund said. "You were speaking of her as though her value depended upon remaining conveniently small." No one moved. Sir Lionel gave a short laugh. "You are determined to make a great matter of a trifle." Edmund's gaze did not leave him. "Miss Harcourt is not a trifle." He turned then, not only to Sir Lionel, but to the room at large. "If Halverton Hall appears tonight in better condition than when I first came to it, that is owing in no small part to Miss Harcourt's judgment, labour and honesty. She has seen what others softened, spoken where others would have flattered, and given this house more practical wisdom than many men would have thought to offer, and fewer would have had the sense to welcome." Eliza felt the blood leave her face and return at once. No one had ever spoken of her before company in that manner. Not as a convenience, not as an appendage to other people's stories, but as herself, fully and plainly. Edmund continued, and now there was something in his expression not often seen in public, not restraint merely, but resolve made personal. When the stores were ill-managed, she saw it. When the servants were overburdened, she understood how the work truly moved. When repairs could not wait, she knew it before others would admit it. "If this house stands on steadier ground tonight, I will not have the credit blurred into vague praise or careless amusement." His gaze moved once across the room. "I owe Miss Harcourt respect. So does this house. I have no wish to say it softly." No one spoke for a moment after that. Sir Lionel looked as though he had swallowed something both sharp and indigestible. Mrs. Dalrymple was openly delighted. Mrs. Merriweather seemed torn between approval and alarm. Miss Langley and Lucy stared at Edmund with the reverence young women reserve for either heroes or people who have done something sufficiently unexpected to resemble them. As for Lady Agnes, she sat in majestic composure, wearing the expression of a woman who had at last been paid in good coin, after too long accepting promises. Sir Lionel bowed, because even men injured in their vanity must perform civilization. "Then I stand corrected." "Yes," said Lady Agnes into the silence. "You often do." Laughter broke then, enough to release the room from suspense. Cards were reclaimed. Somebody asked Lucy for another song. Mrs. Dalrymple remarked, with perfect audibility, that honesty was particularly refreshing indoors. Yet the axis of the evening had shifted. Edmund turned slightly toward Eliza. In a lower voice, meant for her alone, he said, "I should have spoken sooner." She looked up at him. The silence between them seemed to gather everything the past few days had left unresolved. "Yes," she said. The word was quiet, but it was not simple. From the far side of the room, Lady Agnes called, with deliberate brightness, "Edmund, if you have done reforming society, do come and rescue Mrs. Dalrymple from whist. She confuses trumps with destiny." Mrs. Dalrymple lifted her brows. "I do no such thing. I merely prefer the dramatic possibilities of a bad hand." The interruption, absurd and merciful, restored motion to the room. Edmund stepped back, though not very far. "I am commanded," he said. "You had better obey," Eliza said. "There are some authorities," he said, and now the ghost of his old dryness returned. "I have learned not to challenge." A breath of humour touched her at last. It was the first ease that had passed between them in days, and it felt so precious that she scarcely trusted it. He inclined his head and moved away. The evening continued. Lucy sang with uncommon sweetness and forgot only one line, which Lady Agnes declared a moderate success. Cards were won and lost. Sir Lionel did not again approach Eliza except with the caution of a man lately introduced to consequences. Halverton Hall held its ground to the end, but Eliza scarcely remembered the later hours distinctly. What remained with her was Edmund's voice. "Miss Harcourt is not a trifle." And after that, more dangerous still. "I owe Miss Harcourt respect. So does this house." He had not hidden her. He had not corrected her into silence or safety, before the very people whose opinion could wound or preserve. He had named her worth plainly and made no apology for doing so. When at last the evening began to loosen at the edges, Eliza stood for a moment in the entrance hall beneath the last of the roses she had chosen that morning. Voices still wandered down from the stairs and out of the drawing-room. Footmen moved through candlelight with practised discretion. Lucy was somewhere behind her, speaking brightly to Miss Langley about music. Lady Agnes, with Augustus restored to her side, was governing the diminished party with serene command. Across the hall, Edmund had just seen the Fenwicks out and was insisting, in a tone too low to carry but too decided to mistake, that a carriage be made ready to take Lucy and Eliza home. He looked up, only for a moment. Yet in that moment, Eliza knew that nothing between them could ever again be what it had once been. Too much had passed in silence, and too much had now been said aloud. When she stepped out into the cool night air, the gravel glittered faintly under the lamps, and the house behind her shone with that particular brightness large windows borrow from candlelight and success. Yet for Eliza, the true event of the evening had not been the success of the house party at all. It had been the moment Edmund chose, before them all, not prudence but truth. And though no further word had passed between them, something essential had been restored. Not ease, not yet, but honour. And as the carriage carried her and Lucy home through the soft, dark lanes, with Lucy sighing in happy exhaustion at her side, describing Lady Agnes's expressions with alarming precision, Eliza sat very still and held one thought close in the quiet of her own heart. Whatever came next, he had not let the world make her small. Chapter 10. The Morning Room. The morning after the house party dawned pale and quiet, as if the house itself were recovering from candlelight, company, and success. Halverton Hall looked gentler in the early hour. Mist still clung to the gravel before the steps. The lawns beyond lay silvered with dew. Inside, the great rooms were hushed in that brief interval before servants resumed their ordinary clatter, and guests began to ring for hot water, chocolate, missing brushes and information. Eliza had come early. She had not come to inspect the flowers, nor to settle breakfast trays, nor even to see whether Mrs. Wren required help restoring order after the triumph of the evening before. She had come to leave. In the small morning room near the side passage, where the eastern light fell clear and cool across the floor, Eliza came to collect the things she had left there earlier. Her gloves beside a small work-box, her shawl folded with habitual care over the back of a chair. Nothing in the arrangement was dramatic. It was only orderly. That, she thought, was perhaps the saddest sort of departure. The evening before, Edmund had honoured her before the room. He had spoken of her judgment and labour as though they were not merely useful but valuable in themselves. He had done what she had once feared he never could. The memory of it still warmed her, and because it did she knew she must go. He had spoken for her, but he had not spoken to her. That difference mattered. The memory of that gave Eliza the faintest smile. Then the smile faded. A soft weight landed on the back of the chair behind her. Eliza turned. Marmalade had leapt onto her brown shawl, draped there with the complete assurance of a creature who considered all fabric temporarily his. He turned once in its folds, settled himself along the top of the chair, and began with great seriousness to wash one paw. "Marmalade," she said quietly. "I should have known better." Marmalade tucked his paws beneath him, as though his comfort had settled the question of departure. She moved to lift him. At that moment, the door behind her opened. She knew it was Edmund before he spoke. There are steps a woman learns too well against her own interest. He stopped just inside the room. His eyes went first to her, then to the few things she had come to collect, neatly arranged beside the chair, then to Marmalade enthroned upon the shawl, as though he objected to any alteration in the scene. Eliza. He had used her name before, once, in pain. This time he spoke it without formality at all, and the sound of it in the still morning room struck through her with quiet force. She turned. He was not dressed for company, not fully. He wore a dark morning coat over a plain waistcoat, his cravat less ceremonious than the evening before, his hair not quite so rigorously arranged. He looked like a man who had come early and directly, with no wish to allow good manners time to interfere with necessity. His gaze moved again to the few things she had come to collect. The shawl, the workbox, the gloves upon the table. "You meant to go without seeing me." It was not an accusation. It sounded more like the plain naming of a hurt. Eliza steadied herself. "I thought it better." "For whom?" "For us both." He came farther into the room then, though not so near as to press her. "No," he said, "easier perhaps, not better." She tried to answer and found that the composure she had prepared so carefully had become useless in the face of his honesty. "My lord." "Do not call me that now." His voice was low, controlled, and already fraying at the edges. "Not when I have come precisely to speak as a man and not as a title." That silenced her. He drew a breath. She saw him gather himself not for polish, but for truth. "I know I hurt you," he said. "I thought I was protecting you. In fact, I asked you to bear the burden of my caution, and I have despised myself for it ever since." She looked at him. She had imagined an apology. She had imagined sincerity. She had not imagined this strict plainness. "You need not despise yourself," she said softly. "Yes, I do." A faint, humorless smile touched his mouth and vanished. "At least enough to remember the lesson." He stepped nearer. Morning light from the window caught the line of his face and showed the lack of rest in it. "I have spent my life believing that if one observed, measured, arranged, and decided carefully enough, one could prevent disorder from becoming ruin. That may answer well enough for ledgers and chimneys. It does not answer in matters of the heart. There I have behaved like a fool, and a methodical one besides." Despite everything, she gave a small, unwilling laugh. His expression changed. "I have missed that," he said. His gaze held hers. "Do you know what this house has sounded like these last few days, when you would hardly speak to me? Footsteps, doors, complaints, necessary noises, and no warmth in any of them. Even when you were in the room, something had gone out of it." Her throat tightened. He went on more steadily now. "Because truth, once begun, had found its own road. You saw what mattered, and you would not let me look away from it. I told myself that was all, but it was never all. It was your voice I listened for in a room, your step I knew in the passage, your opinion I wanted even when I had no wish to deserve it." Eliza felt tears rise at that. Not from sorrow, but from the sharp relief of finding herself so exactly seen. He seemed to know it, and the knowledge roughened his own voice. "The house changed under your hands. That everyone can see. But it was not only the house." She did not move. "It was my life," he said simply. The words hung in the pale air between them. He took another step. "And now there was little distance left at all. I began by admiring you. That was unavoidable. Then I relied on you. That too became unavoidable. Somewhere between the pantry shelves, the muddy lanes, the greenhouse, and all the absurd interruptions this house could invent, I came to understand that the best part of my day was always the part in which I might see what you would notice, hear what you would say, or catch, if I were fortunate, some sign that you did not think me entirely hopeless. Eliza drew in a trembling breath. When we quarrelled, he said, the whole house felt altered. It was then I knew there was no use pretending to myself any longer. He paused then, not because he had finished, but because what remained cost him more. When he spoke again, his voice had softened. I do not want you only when there is confusion to mend. I want you in the ordinary days and the difficult ones. At breakfast when nothing has gone wrong. In the gardens when something has. Beside me when tenants must be heard, when guests must be endured, when the whole county behaves like a nursery full of malicious aunts. I want your judgment because I trust it, your wit because I need it, and your heart because mine is yours already. For one suspended moment, she could not answer at all. Every anxious hope she had forbidden herself stood there in plain daylight, impossible now to dismiss as imagination. Yet one thing remained. Not doubt of his feelings now. That had been answered too clearly. But the old wound required one final truth before it could close. She lifted her eyes to his. You speak of trust and need and wanting me beside you. But do you understand what you ask? Her voice was gentle but firm. I cannot come into Halverton Hall only to be useful forever, Edmund. I cannot spend my life rescuing dinners and mending oversights while everyone praises my value and forgets that I am also a woman, with pride, temper, vanity, and a heart that can be wounded. His face changed at once, not in offence but in recognition. She went on because she must. I do not wish to be thanked into a corner. I do not wish to become the invisible force that keeps a great house pleasant while being spoken of as though I were part of its furniture. I could not bear that from anyone, least of all from you. No, he said. Nor should you. His answer came so directly that some last knot in her chest loosened. He stepped close enough now that she could see the faint strain at the edge of his mouth, the sleeplessness in his eyes, the hope he was trying not to force upon her. I am not asking for grateful assistance, he said. I am asking for partnership. The words settled over her like warmth. I am asking whether you will share this house, this work, and my life. Whether you will let me consult you openly, value you openly, and love you without asking you ever again to stand smaller than you are. His voice had gone lower by the end, steadier and more vulnerable at once. Eliza, he said, and now there was no shield left in him at all. Will you marry me? For 1 second, the old instinct to answer lightly fluttered through her. Instead, she did the braver thing. She told the truth. Yes, she whispered first. And then, because he deserved to hear it plainly, yes, I will. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if the word had struck him with physical force. When he opened them again, all the composure that had made him so formidable in drawing rooms and so difficult in arguments had given way to something warmer, younger, and almost disbelieving. Eliza. This time her name in his voice sounded like home. A small laugh broke from her then, half joy and half relief. I believe that means I must cease calling you my lord in moments of distress. It would ease me greatly if you did. She smiled fully now, the first unguarded smile she had given him since before their quarrel. And the sight of it transformed him. He reached for her hand slowly enough to give her time to refuse. She placed it in his at once. His fingers closed around hers with reverence and gratitude and love so evident that she could not look away from him. I do not know, he said, with a breath that might almost have been wonder, how I contrived to make such poor work of arriving here. You are not especially swift in matters of feeling. No, he admitted, though I hope to improve under good management. She laughed then, properly this time, and the sound seemed to lift the whole room. Marmalade, who had listened to these proceedings with tolerant detachment from the back of the chair, opened one eye, as if to confirm that humans were indeed as melodramatic as he had long suspected, then resettled himself. Edmund glanced toward the chair. Even the cat appears resigned to the match. He had committed himself to it earlier. A more decisive creature than I. Certainly swifter. He bowed his head over her hand. I deserve that. For a little while, neither of them spoke. They stood in the quiet morning room, with the pale light widening around them, the workbox still on the table, and her shawl occupied by an orange cat who appeared to consider himself the final authority against departure. At last, Eliza said softly, "I had meant to leave because I did not know whether what I felt belonged to me alone." His gaze sharpened with pain and relief together. "It never did." "No," she said, "I know that now." He let out a slow breath, as if some inward tension he had carried for days had at last begun to loosen. He lifted her hand and pressed it to his lips. Then, because some joys ought not to be indefinitely postponed by excessive nobility, he drew a little closer and touched his forehead briefly to hers. The contact was small, tender, enough. In the corridor beyond came the faint sound of a footman passing with hot water, and, farther off, Lady Agnes's voice saying, with satisfaction not nearly so discreet as she would later claim, "I told you he would need the morning." Eliza's smile trembled into something softer. Edmund heard it too, and his own mouth curved. "My aunt will be insufferable. She will be correct." "Yes," he said, "that is the worst of it." He drew back just far enough to look at her properly again. "Will you stay this morning?" The question touched her almost as much as his proposal. "Yes," she said, "I think I shall." Epilogue.At Home. A year later, Halverton Hall no longer looked like a handsome house apologizing for its own neglect. It lived well. The change showed itself in ordinary details. Cracked panes had been replaced. Curtains once faded into resignation had been cleaned, relined, or quietly renewed. Doors shut properly. Fires drew cleanly. The chimneys, after one memorable campaign involving soot, ladders, and 3 men who all claimed superior knowledge, had given up disgracing the family. Outside, the gardens had regained both shape and temper. The borders were full and well kept, the gravel neatly edged, and the climbing roses were tied where they ought to be tied and left alone where they preferred independence. In the greenhouse, the citrus trees were healthier, the cuttings better ordered, and Barnes, though still suspicious of enthusiasm, had become almost companionable under the influence of regular wages and the Countess's refusal to let anyone drown a geranium out of affection. He had even come to accept the Earl among the roses as part of the natural order. The servants work differently too. Not with fear, and not with that slack despair which comes of knowing labour will vanish into disorder by evening, but with steadier confidence. Halverton Hall had become a place where life was expected to continue well tomorrow. In a country house, that is one of the deepest forms of peace. Mrs. Biddle remained formidable, which everyone agreed was proper. Marmalade remained no less so in his own sphere, and still regarded every dish containing cream as a matter requiring his close personal oversight. Eliza had not vanished into the title of Countess of Halverton, as though marriage had folded her up and set her on a shelf. She moved through the house and estate with the same quick intelligence she had always possessed, only now she did so openly and by right as well as usefulness. If a guest room wanted airing, she knew it before the guest did. If a tenant's wife needed broth after a confinement, a basket appeared without noise. If Lucy sent a note declaring she would arrive on Thursday and bring only a modest quantity of ribbon for bonnet trimming, Eliza knew to tell Mrs. Wren to prepare for twice that amount, and a degree of cheerful disorder. Love had not softened her edges, it had only made happiness sit more easily upon her. Edmund himself had changed too, though less obviously, and much to his own surprise. He remained exact, he still kept lists, he still preferred accounts to vagueness and direct speech to ornament, except on the rare occasions when ornament might amuse Eliza. But he had grown easier in the life of the house, and less disposed to stand apart from its confusions and affections, as though authority depended upon distance. He consulted more readily, listened sooner, and had developed under his wife's influence, Lady Agnes maintained, though he denied it, a tolerance for interruptions that would once have seemed a most unwise concession to human weakness. Mr. and Mrs. Harcourt were delighted by the marriage, and could not help hoping that Lucy, by frequent proximity to so fortunate a connection, might find her own prospects somewhat advanced. Lady Agnes, for her part, visited often enough to keep everyone properly alert and socially entertained. She continued to regard Halverton Hall as a place improved by her presence and, to the annoyance of several neighbours, was not entirely wrong. Even Augustus and Marmalade had, after due suspicion, arrived at a kind of truce. Late one June afternoon, with dinner still an hour away and the heat gentled into gold, Eliza crossed the hall carrying a shallow basket of roses she had cut herself from the south border. Edmund came in from outside as she passed the drawing-room door, hat in hand, sunlight still on his coat. Lady Agnes, pausing at Halverton Hall on her way back from Bath and declaring herself too fatigued to travel farther until morning, had spent the day improving everyone with observations. He stopped at once when he saw her. Marriage had not cured him of that. Eliza lifted a brow. "You stare, my lord." "Habit," he said. A lazy defence, Eliza returned. "A truthful one." He fell into step beside her. "And what else have you arranged this afternoon besides flowers?" "The schoolroom roof will be mended on Monday. Mrs. Toller's boy has boots at last. Lucy threatens to visit next week." "All excellent news," Edmund said. Then he added, in the softness he kept for her alone, "Have you arranged anything for yourself?" She looked at him, and her eyes warmed. "I have arranged to walk in the rose garden before dinner with my husband, provided he behaves tolerably. I can make no promise where roses are concerned. I know you become absurd near me." "That too." He took one rose from the basket, pale and just opening, and offered it back to her. She accepted it, and together they stepped out into the garden. The paths were warm underfoot. Bees moved lazily among the lavender. The rose border, once neglected, now stood in generous bloom against the clipped green beyond. Somewhere near the greenhouse barns could be heard arguing with a boy about compost, which reassured the whole scene by proving it had not become too polished. Edmund offered Eliza his arm. She laid her hand upon it with gladness she did not trouble to conceal. For a while they walked in silence, as people do when silence itself has become companionable. Edmund said, "Dr. Fairchild was very calm about it." Eliza glanced up at him. "I believe that is generally considered a virtue in a physician." "I am not sure I found it so." Her smile deepened. "No?" "No. I thought a matter of such consequence might have startled him into greater respect." She laughed softly. "He has likely seen husbands thunderstruck before." "I was not thunderstruck." "You were silent for nearly a full minute." "I was exercising gravity." "You were staring at the carpet as though it had altered beneath your feet." He looked down at her with the air of a man prepared to defend himself on insufficient grounds. It had. Her expression softened then, all teasing gentled by tenderness. "Yes," she said, "mine too." For a few steps they walked on in quiet, the garden warm around them, the late roses breathing sweetness into the air. Then Edmund said, more softly, "Are you well?" She turned her hand where it rested on his arm and held it there more firmly. "I am very well." "Tired?" "A little." "Overwhelmed?" "At moments." "Happy?" At that she stopped and looked at him fully. "Very," she said. Something in his face gave way then, not into surprise now, but into the kind of joy that was too deep for display and therefore showed itself only in stillness. He bent and kissed her forehead. "I have spent the last half-hour," he said, alternating between gratitude, astonishment, and a most unreasonable desire to dismiss the entire county for the next 7 months. That would create comment. "I am prepared to endure it." "You are not," she said. "You dislike comment even when it is favourable." "I dislike anything that supposes a right to an opinion on you." She smiled at that, and they began to walk on again. "Lady Agnes will say she knew it first," Eliza said. "She will say she knew it before either of us, and has only been waiting for the doctor to catch up," he laughed. "Yes," Eliza said, "and she will be more trying than ever." He smiled. "Then we had better go at once and present ourselves." "To Aunt Agnes." "To Aunt Agnes." Eliza's eyes brightened. "Together." He looked at her as though there could be no other answer in any tolerable world. "Together," he said. So they turned from the rose walk toward the house. Not quickly, for there was no need of haste. but with the quiet certainty of lives changed by joy. At the open door, Marmalade regarded them with solemn distrust, as if domestic developments of this magnitude ought to have been referred to him sooner. Edmund opened the door and offered Eliza his arm with mock ceremony. "Come," he said, "let us go and allow Aunt Agnes the satisfaction of having been right." Eliza laughed, took his arm, and went with him into the house. And so, Halverton Hall is left full of comfort, laughter, and new beginnings. If you enjoyed this tender Regency romance, another awaits. Listen to The Borrowed Prince, a full Regency romance audiobook where a prince in disguise longs to be loved for himself, not the crown he bears. Tap the video on your screen to continue listening. I shall return soon with another romance, unless I've been spirited away by moonlight and mischief.